Hey guys, tonight we begin how 17th century Parisians got lost in mazes for fun. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So UV'd is the year 1662, and the air in Paris is thick with the scents of early summer roses. Damp earth, and the faint tang of horse dung mingling with bakery smoke. The city is swelling with culture and vanity, hosting one of the grandest transformations in urban planning since ancient Rome. But in the quieter corners of society, not in the salons or theaters, there is a peculiar trend taking root among the wealthier classes, getting lost on purpose. We're standing just beyond the gates of the Palatial Gardens. The marble statues catch golden light between the trees, and the quiet murmuring of promenading couples echoes down clipped hedgerows. To your left, a group of schoolchildren in ruffled collars walk in single file under the watchful eyes of a stern tutor. To your right is a maze neatly trimmed and sprawling, curiously intricate, the hedges just high enough to obscure the path. Ahead, this is not a metaphor. It is a literal maze. And if you were a Parisian noble in the 17th century with nothing urgent to do perhaps, your tailor is late, or your chamber orchestra is rehearsing you, might step into one of these leafy labyrinths and happily spend hours wandering utterly and delightfully lost. Mazes, or labyrinths, became unexpectedly popular during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, known for his vanity and obsession with control. Louis famously commissioned the maze at the gardens of Versailles, filled with fountains and sculptures of Aesop's fables. But this craze did not begin in Versailles. Origins were far more mundane and suburban. In 1630s Paris, enterprising gardeners began carving simple mazes into the private lands of nobles in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, an area now known more for embassies and boutiques than twisted hedges, inspired by Italian Renaissance garden design. These mazes began as little more than status symbols, a nod to classical learning, a wink to ancient myths like that of Daedalus and the Minotaur. But what started as an architectural flourish soon became a pastime in its own right. By the 1650s, the act of walking a maze was no longer just a symbol of wealth, it was an event, that often accompanied by musicians and refreshments. Nobles would plan entire afternoon visits to each other's estates solely to wander in hedged enclosures. Gentlewomen in towering periwigs giggled behind feathered fans as they tried to find their way to the center. Men would sometimes leave, coded notes hidden within the branches. Mazes became sites of whispered gossip, spontaneous poetry, and secret rendezvous. But perhaps the strangest part of this whole trend is how willingly people got lost. In a society increasingly obsessed with order, structure, and regulation reflected in the rigid social etiquette and precise courtly manners of Louis XIV. France, the idea of willingly surrendering one's direction in a carefully controlled environment held a peculiar allure. Mazes were not chaotic jungles. They were spaces of sanctioned disorder. If you were one of these nobles or even one of the rare bourgeois families allowed to visit public gardens, you might begin your maze experience with a small printed map. It's purchased from a gatekeeper or vendor. These maps were intentionally vague. They might mark a fountain here, a statue there, but never the actual path. It was understood that the fun was in not knowing. The rules of maze etiquette passed quietly through households and salons were strict. One did not run, one did not shout, one did not ask a gardener for directions unless a full hour had passed. Children were expected to enter with a minder or older sibling, lest they wander into tears and panic. And if you encountered another person, especially one of higher rank, stepped aside and allowed them the rite of passage, even if you believed they were walking in the wrong direction. In this way, 17th century garden mazes functioned not only as recreational novelties, but also as subtle reinforcements of social order. You could get lost, yes, but only within the rules. In losing your direction, you were reminded of your place. One of the most famous of these mazes sat in the gardens of the Hôtel de Rambouillet, a literary salon famous for its pretentious aristocratic. Women known for their love of poetic refinement and philosophical debate. According to a letter written in 1656 by Mademoiselle de Scudéry, a regular visitor, the maze there was no less a mirror of wit than a trap for the idle mind. She described writing verse on slips of ribbon and tying them to branches as she walked, hoping others would find them and reply in kind. You might imagine the scene: a late afternoon in spring, the buzz of bees over roses, a faint breeze rustling the hedges. A gentleman turns a corner to find a poem wrapped in silk and smiles to himself. Perhaps he pens a quick response with his quill and attaches it to the same branch. The next visitor finds 2 poems and adds a third. In this way, the maze becomes not only a game of direction, but a living journal, a hidden, leafy conversation stretched across days.
Some mazes.
Especially those influenced by the more decadent tastes of court began to include mechanical surprises. Water jets triggered by foot pressure would splash unsuspecting wanderers. False doors opened to reveal mirrors or grotesque faces carved in wood. One famous maze near the Marais was said to contain a puppet show, revealed only when a visitor pulled the right ivy-covered cord. But even beyond the nobility, mazes began to filter into public life. By the 1670s, some enterprising merchants offered temporary mazes at fairs or on the outskirts of the city, made of canvas walls or bundled reeds. For a few sous, the lower classes could sample the confusion once reserved for nobles. These mazes were simpler, of course, but they retained the same quiet thrill, the same act of deliberate disorientation in a world otherwise rigid and known. Why, then, did this fashion not last? There are hints in the diaries of travelers and the records of city officials that the popularity of mazes began to wane by the turn of the 18th century. The expense of maintaining hedge walls, the changing tastes in garden design, and the rise of more theatrical entertainments all played a part. Labyrinths became curiosities once again, reduced to mythic symbols or children's puzzles. And yet, for nearly 50 years, the act of getting lost became one of the quietest forms of pleasure in Paris. People built entire afternoons around confusion, not to solve it, but to dwell in it. In a time of rigid structure and expanding state power, these leafy traps offered a rare permission to drift. As we stand here, just inside the maze's entrance, with the hedges whispering promises and the path ahead hidden from view, we are left with a question that even the most well-bred noble could not quite answer. Was the goal to find the center, or to never quite arrive? The maze was never just a game. It was an idea woven into the tapestries of daily life, stitched into literature, whispered through the salons of Paris. By the second half of the 17th century, the maze had become more than hedgerows and meandering paths. It had become a metaphor, a social ritual, a kind of polite madness practiced with gloves and fans. You may be wondering, how could something as quiet and aimless as wandering through greenery become such a widespread obsession? To understand that, you have to look beyond the gardens. You have to walk into the minds of the people who built them. By the 1660s, Paris was a city obsessed with control. The rise of Louis XIV had ushered in an era of spectacle and regulation. Every movement at court, every sentence spoken in noble company, was measured by its appropriateness. Social life was a kind of performance, and deviation from its unwritten script was unthinkable. For the aristocracy, even joy was choreographed. And yet the human mind seeks play. Enter the maze space, where one could fail without shame. A hedge maze had no audience, no king watching, and no repercussions for a misstep. You could wander in silence, make decisions based on nothing but whim, and simply turn around if you were wrong. It was freedom in a box, but perhaps more than the pleasure of confusion. The maze became popular because it mirrored the intellectual fashion of the time, the love of riddles, allegory, and layered meanings. Consider the literature of the era. Madeleine de Scudéry. Yes, it's the same woman who left poetry in the Hôtel de Rambouillet's maze, was also famous for her 10-volume novel, Artaman ou le Grand Cyrus. It was over 2 million words long and filled with digressions, false identities, symbolic characters, and nested stories within stories. Reading it was, quite literally, like navigating a labyrinth of ideas. In fact, literary mazes were everywhere. Authors and thinkers prized works that offered not simplicity, but complexity works. That rewarded patient, circuitous exploration. The structure of these narratives often mimicked the maze experience: long build-ups, detours, puzzles, and eventually, a center or not. This mirrored the larger philosophical turn toward Cartesian thought. René Descartes, whose discourse De la Méthode had shaken European intellectual life in 1637, championed methodical doubt and the slow, deliberate path to truth. In a strange way, the maze was a physical embodiment of Descartes' system, beginning with doubt, navigating uncertainty, and progressing step by step toward clarity. Even sermons adopted the metaphor. A priest, preaching at the church of Saint Eustache, once compared the Christian life to a labyrinth filled with turns, temptations, and delays, but with a central truth waiting for those who persist. The faithful, he said, must wander with trust. Though the hedges be high and the heavens sometimes silent, but not everyone was charmed by this leafy preoccupation. In 1672, a pamphlet titled Labyrinth de la Nuit, The Labyrinth of Boredom, appeared anonymously in Paris. It mocked the upper class for wasting hours in what the author called the empty maze of self-admiration. The tract described nobles stumbling around garden paths while the poor starved in the streets beyond the walls. They wander in circles, the author wrote, believing they are philosophers when they are merely lost. Others took a more practical issue. Gardeners who bore the burden of maintaining these living walls often complained in letters and journals. Single hedge could take 3 hours to trim to court standards. Insects flourished in the tight greenery. Watering had to be done by hand, bucket by bucket, often before dawn. The hedge maze was, in many ways, a perfect symbol of French aristocratic life, beautiful, intricate, expensive, and utterly indifferent to those who labored beneath its surface. Still, despite criticisms, the fashion for mazes continued to evolve. New designs borrowed from mathematics and geometry. One Jesuit-trained architect named Pierre Leclerc developed what he called moral mazes, structured so that each dead end featured an engraving of a vice such as envy, pride, or sloth, while each correct turn featured a virtue. He claimed that by walking the maze regularly, the soul would learn discipline through the feet. Whether anyone truly repented after reaching a cul-de-sac labeled avarice is unlikely. But the trend reflects how seriously people took these gardens not as mere novelty, but as spaces of meaning. Even children were drawn into the tradition, though in carefully controlled ways. A treatise on proper exercises for young gentlefolk, published in 1681, recommended that boys aged 9 to 13 be walked through simple mazes as a test of memory and spatial reasoning. Girls were encouraged to memorize poems found within the hedges and recite them at family gatherings. Thus, the maze served as both a game and a grooming tool, a place to teach discipline masked as delight. Over time, architects experimented with different hedge heights, ground markings, and sensory elements. One famous maze at the Château de Choisy used fragrant plants lavender, rosemary, and lemon verbenesso. Visitors could find their way based on scent rather than sight. Another near Fontainebleau included gravel paths of varying textures, some smooth, others rough, designed to be walked barefoot for moral alertness. This was a time, after all, when every act was interpreted through a moral lens. Even a hedge was not just a hedge, it was a statement about one's values, one's sense of beauty, and often one's proximity to power. But the most telling detail of all may be how these mazes were spoken about at court. It was said that Louis XIV, who famously commissioned André Lenantre to design the vast gardens of Versailles, viewed the maze not as a game but as a metaphor. For his reign, the Versailles labyrinth, built in 1677 and destroyed in 1778. Each turn was marked with a fountain and a moral fable. The king would lead foreign dignitaries through the paths, citing the meanings of the sculptures like a teacher guiding a child. But the Versailles maze was different from the others. It was not meant to confuse the king, it was meant to teach his guests. In this way, the hedge maze reached its final paradox. What had begun as a space of leisure and wandering had become, under the Sun King, a tool of spectacle and instruction. No longer a place to get lost, it had become a place to be guided. By the early 1700s, the charm had faded. Tastes changed. The English-style garden, wild, pastoral, and asymmetrical, began to replace the rigid geometries of French design. Mazes were torn up, or allowed to grow wild, or repurposed as orchards. They vanished quietly into the soil from which they came, and yet their legacy remained. Some whispered that the fashion for riddles and misdirection found new life in diplomacy and salon politics. Others said the mazes taught a generation to hide their intentions behind pleasant turns and clipped phrases. A few literary critics even claimed that the novel itself, especially the long-winded, circuitous French novel, was the true heir of the hedge maze. So perhaps the mazes never vanished at all. They simply changed form. And now, as we step out of this once grand enclosure, with only trimmed grass and a faint scent of lilac remaining, one final question still lingers. Did the maze teach Parisians how to escape, or how to stay hidden? As you return to the hedged paths of the 17th century Parisian maze one final time, the air feels cooler, the light dimmer. The hedges are not as precisely trimmed. Some corners smell of damp leaves and untended soil. The music has stopped. Fountains have grown silent. It is the early 18th century, and the garden maze once the favored pastime of nobles. Poets and philosophers has begun to wither, both literally and culturally. Paris, too, is changing. The scent of revolution is still decades away, but the foundations of a new social order are quietly forming beneath the carefully shaped topiaries and marble statues. By the 1720s, the rigid geometry of French formal gardens was already being questioned. A new wave of landscape design, heavily influenced by English sensibilities, was sweeping through Europe. The symmetry of Lantre's creations, once the gold standard of elegance, was now viewed by many as artificial and oppressive. In their place came Jardin Angle styles, rolling hills, winding paths, irregular groves, and natural-looking vistas meant to imitate untouched countryside. Even in the heart of the city, where the maze had once stood as a celebration of controlled disorientation, it was now seen as a relic of excessa, toy of an indulgent aristocracy. The public, increasingly literate and politicized, found little charm in the idea of nobles. Wandering aimlessly behind hedge walls while common folk wrestled with food prices and housing shortages, but even as physical mazes began to vanish from gardens and estates, their imprint remained carried in memory, literature, and metaphor. You can still trace their shape, faint and overgrown, in the memoirs of those who once walked them. For instance, the writing of Madame de Genlis, a prominent writer and educator of the late 18th century. In her reflections on childhood and morality, she recounts being led into a small maze outside Paris by her governess as a form of both amusement and lesson. She described her early frustration at being turned about by green walls, only to later recognize it as a symbol for the choices one makes in life, how pride may lead to dead ends, and patience may guide one forward. The maze, in other words, had become internalized. In the same way that classical architecture informed the layout of entire cities, the structure of the garden maze informed how people thought about complexity, struggle, and pursuit. It appeared in moral tales, it lingered in the design of salons and reading rooms. It took root in the minds of thinkers, as a spatial metaphor for introspection. In many ways, the maze reflected something deeper about the human condition, our willingness to submit ourselves to confusion, and our quiet delight in the moment before a decision is made. But not everyone looked back so fondly. By the time Voltaire was penning his critiques of aristocratic life, he included a passing reference to garden mazes in Candide, comparing them to the illusions of court life, one turn away from hope, one turn from despair. It was no longer a compliment. The maze had become a symbol not of playful confusion, but of purposeless ritual. The Versailles labyrinth, perhaps the most famous of them all, was dismantled in 1778, cut down to make way for a more fashionable arboretum. The carefully maintained hedges, the mythic fountains, and the plaques inscribed with Aesop's fables all were cleared away. Their parts sold, burnt, or left to rot. The king no longer led visitors through the winding paths. The Sun King's symbolic garden had lost its relevance in a world slowly turning toward revolution. Even in private estates, the cost of maintaining a maze became unjustifiable. A hedge requires trimming every 2 weeks during the growing season. A maze, 10 times the labor. And with every year, more and more estate owners chose to replace them with gravel walks, orchards, or open lawns. Still, the memory of mazes endured in unexpected places. Some Parisian boarding schools, as late as the 1790s, retained small training municipal labyrinths of waist-high shrubs used as walking spaces for discipline. Students were required to walk the path slowly, often with books in hand. 1. Headmaster even believed that walking in turns calms the excesses of youth. There is a quiet poetry in that a vision of children marching through tiny hedged corridors, unaware that they are rehearsing a game once beloved by poets and princes. And beyond France, the influence of the 17th century Parisian maze spread and evolved. The English adopted the idea but reinterpreted it with humor and trickery. At Hampton Court, a maze built in the 1690s still stands, a living relic of a broader European fascination that was born, in part, on Parisian soil. In the 19th century, Romantic thinkers rediscovered the idea of the labyrinth as a symbol of the soul's journey. Writers like Victor Hugo and Charles Baudelaire invoked maze-like metaphors in their work, tracing emotional, moral, and philosophical meanderings through poetic language. The hedges may have vanished, but the paths remain drawn in ink instead of soil. Even today, modern Paris holds on to faint echoes of that strange, leafy pastime. If you walk through the Parc Monceau or the Jardin des Plantes, you might stumble across curving paths that suggest but do not confirm the presence of a maze. They double back, veer unexpectedly, and offer glimpses of sculpture or pond always inviting, never quite revealing. They are the ghosts of hedges long since uprooted, or perhaps the true ghost is in the way we still talk about problems. Navigate complexity, we lose ourselves in thought, and we trace a path through confusion. The language of the labyrinth lingers in how we describe the simplest mental acts. And so, as we step back from this history, from the salons of the Pertuses to the clippers of exhausted gardeners, we are left with a peculiar lesson that sometimes the most enduring monuments are not those made of stone, but those shaped in thought and repeated in metaphor. The Parisian maze may have vanished from the gardens, but not from the mind. So the next time you feel lost not physically but emotionally or intellectually, consider that you may be retracing a path once walked by powdered nobles, whispering poets, and wandering philosophers. And perhaps the question to ask is not how to get out, but whether you're meant to find something within. The Thames moved slowly on an overcast morning in 1752. Barges creak against moss-covered pilings. Dockworkers, pale with river fog and fatigue, haul sacks and crates down slippery gangplanks. A bell rings from a customs house tower, lost almost immediately in the groan of ropes and the cough of smoke. This is London before industry in its full bloom, before railways, before bridges choked with horse-drawn omnibuses. But already it pulses with trade. And somewhere in this haze of wood, sweat, and cargo sits a building no larger than a modest church but more guarded than some royal houses, a tea warehouse. You are standing in front of the East India Company's Thameside Depot at Crutched Friars, just a few minutes' walk from the Tower of London. It is unmarked to the casual eye brick, soot-blackened, its windows high and barred. There are no signs, no posted announcements. Only the company crest, faintly visible above a loading gate, gives any hint of what lies within. Tied, however, are piles of empire, not gold or jewels, but crates dozens, hundreds of crates, stacked floor to ceiling, each filled with tea. Dried leaves harvested in the hills of southern China, packed into chests in Canton, loaded onto ships that have taken months, sometimes more than a year, to return to Britain. This tea is not meant for the aristocracy, who buy their wares in sleek canisters from Bond Street shops, nor is it for the poor, who drink watered-down leaves from reused grounds. This tea is for wholesalers, middlemen, and merchants. It is dusty, sometimes damp, and sometimes infested. but it is also potent and incredibly valuable. You might not think of tea as a dangerous commodity, but in 18th century London, tea was more volatile than tobacco or sugar. Its price could swing wildly with each arriving shipment. It was taxed heavily, stored secretly, and sometimes adulterated with ground leaves from entirely different plants. And behind each crate was a complicated lattice of bureaucracy, smuggling, and speculation. By 1752, the East India Company effectively controlled the British tea trade. It was not just a trading house, it was a government unto itself, with a private army, diplomatic powers, and legal protections. Every chest of tea in London had, at some point, passed through the hands of a company official, clerk, or warehouseman. The warehouse itself operated like a cloister. Entry was restricted. Guards patrolled the corridors. Workers, many of them young, underpaid, and often ill, were searched at the end of each shift for stolen leaves. It was said that a handful of tea could fetch more on the black market than a week's wages. Some warehouse boys reportedly lined their hats with muslin pouches to sneak leaves out. If caught, the punishment could be brutal: docking of pay, public shaming, or even prison. Inside, the air was thick with tannin. Workers complained of headaches and sore throats. Tea dust settled on the skin like chalk. Long hours of lifting. Crates wore joints raw. There were no windows on the lower floors, only a few oil lamps, and the dim glow of daylight from loading docks. Some workers went weeks without seeing the sun during their shifts. But the tea itself, it kept moving. From these warehouses, tea traveled north to warehouses in Covent Garden, to grocers in Marylebone, and to smugglers along the Kent coast. It was packed into new containers, relabeled, and sometimes repackaged with the name of a respectable importer. Some was dyed to appear fresher. Some was blended with cheaper leaves from Java or Bengal. Almost all of it, regardless of its journey, would end up in a pot. A single pound of fine bohea could cost as much as a farm laborer's weekly wage. And yet, by the middle of the century, tea drinking was no longer a noble novelty. It had become part of daily life, especially among London's expanding middle class. It was the drink of clerks, tailors, boarding-house landladies, and even chimney sweeps, who added milk and sugar to mask its bitterness and stretch a cup through morning and night. That tea passed through a warehouse like the one you're standing in now. You wouldn't find the warehouse's records in any museum gift shop today. They weren't glorious. They weren't beautiful. But they are a historical goldmine ledgers, tracking crates by ship, invoice, and estimated moisture content. Some clerks became obsessed with measurements, weight per chest, changes in texture over weeks, signs of mold or sea souring. One man wrote a 36-page manual on the correct angle at which to stack chests to prevent slippage in damp weather. And yet, for all this precision, the warehouse was also a site of quiet decay. Crates broke open, leaves rotted, chewed through. Packaging, river fog crept into cracks. Occasionally, entire rooms would have to be cleared after infestations of mites or damp rot. One 1764 report noted the loss of 13 chests, spoiled by mildew and infested by creeping vermin, unfit for consumption. Contents incinerated. One remembers those workers, not by name, but they left their mark through ink stains and shipping ledgers, footprints on damp floorboards, and the rising taste for tea that would sweep the globe. Behind all this was one truth few at the time dared to speak aloud. This trade, this warehouse, this humble crate of leaves, all of it rested on a deep structure of colonial extraction. The East India Company's presence in China was thin compared to its brutal control in India, but even in China, tea was traded under duress, often for silver or opium, and carried westward by men whose names would never appear in textbooks. The tea warehouse was not a place of glory, but it was a node in one of the world's earliest truly global systems, standing here in this quiet space of dust, tea, and bookkeeping. The glamour of empire fades into something more intimate, more unsettling. These were not palaces. These were workspaces. And yet without them, the empire would not have tasted the same. So what happened to the tea warehouse? What happened when steamships arrived, when trade routes shifted, when China, closed its doors, and India began growing tea of its own. What happened when the quiet stack of crates was replaced by glass-fronted shops and gilded canisters? And what happened to the workers who once lived among the leaves? The year is now 1784. The air along the Thames is cleaner, a little less, choked with coal smoke, but the scent of damp tea still lingers around the East India Company's warehouses. Inside, the crates still arrive heavy, nailed tight, wrapped in cloth and straw, but there is a change. A whisper among the clerks, a different rhythm in the tallying of inventory. The Commutation Act has just passed. To you, standing quietly, beside the door of the crutched friar's warehouse, it might not seem like much. A law adjusting import duties, a simple change in taxation. But this moment marks a turning point, not just in the British tea trade, but in the daily life of almost every tea-drinking household in the nation. For over a century, tea had been taxed heavily. The duties could reach over 100% of its market value, depending on the year. This inflated the price, encouraged widespread smuggling, and made tea a symbol of wealth and power. Entire families passed around the same leaves 3 or 4 times. Tea was stored under lock and key. It was so valuable that in some households, the key to the tea caddy was worn by the lady of the house, like a piece of jewelry. But in 1784, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger slashed the tax rate from a punishing 119% to a manageable 12.5%. His goal? Break the back of the smuggling, trade, and bring tea sales back into legal channels. It worked. Almost overnight, the demand for legally sold tea exploded. Smugglers along the coast, once kings of the black market, found their profit margins vanish. Ships that had once offloaded chests onto quiet coves under moonlight now stood idle. And in London, inside the East India Company's warehouses, the tide of legal imports began to rise with new force. At first, the changes were logistical. More ships, more crates, more workers. A swelling of paperwork. But soon, the real transformation began not in the warehouse, but in the city itself. Tea, once a commodity hidden in crates and sold in bulk, began to migrate from the shadowy world of wholesale into the polished windows of retail. You might walk down Bond Street in 1790 and see a new breed of shop, gleaming, glass-fronted, stocked not with bolts of cloth or barrels of sugar, but with brass canisters of loose-leaf tea. The names were becoming familiar: Bohea, Kongu, Pico, Souchong. You could see the blends. You could sniff the samples. Could, for the first time in London, walk in and purchase a quarter-pound of tea chosen to your liking. Packaged in paper with a logo and a promise. The great warehouses remained, but their mystique began to fade. Once the exclusive gateway to empire, they were now increasingly seen as back-end utilities. The romance of the trade had moved outward into the shops, into the homes of the newly tea-drinking middle classes, into the advertisements in newspapers boasting of fresh Canton Bohea, just arrived at the dock. But not everyone celebrated this new accessibility. Old hands in the warehouse world. Men who had spent decades checking the moisture content of crates and guarding against theft viewed the rise of retail with skepticism. Where once tea was weighed and assessed with careful fingers, it was now measured in polished scoops and sold with cheerful ribbons. The rituals of trade had been replaced by the theater of consumption. And the pace, too, had changed. The old warehouse system was built around slowness, the long journey from China, the careful inspection at port, and the methodical release of goods to the market in waves. But the new consumer culture demanded immediacy. More ships were pressed into service. Steam-powered vessels, though still in their infancy, began to appear on the horizon. Within a few decades, the journey that had once taken months could be measured in weeks. As speed increased, quality began to decline. Clerks, who once wrote detailed notes on the texture of tea leaves, now handled crates for only minutes at a time. Merchants hungry for quicker profits began pushing inferior blends. Some even mixed spent tea leaves with black dye and resold them as fresh. One 1798 scandal involved a shipment of tea leaves dyed with iron filings, leading to dozens of illnesses, and a brief ban on a popular blend called Black Kongu. The warehouse, still full of crates and dust, became a kind of relic necessary, but no longer glorious. Workers still sorted, weighed, and guarded the goods, but their names were never listed on the new retail labels. The spotlight had shifted to the grocers, the shopkeepers, and the tea experts who advised middle-class shoppers on what blend best suited an afternoon chat or a rainy morning by the fire. Meanwhile, the company continued to expand, just in trade, but in power. With India increasingly under its control, the East India Company began planting its own tea fields in Assam by the 1830s. No longer wood. Britain relies solely on Chinese imports. The center of gravity was moving, and with it the purpose of the warehouse. The rise of Indian tea introduced new flavors, new challenges, and new labor abuses. Though far from the damp brick warehouses of London, the plantations of Assam would eventually change the inventory lists here. They introduced a second stream of goods, a competing product, one cheaper and more controllable. Chinese teas still arrived, but they were now complemented and increasingly overshadowed by their colonial counterparts. In the warehouses, the clerks began to note the difference. One wrote in 1812, "The India leaves have a weightier scent and travel with less rot, but the flavor lacks refinement. The market prefers price to grace." It was a quiet comment written in a shipping ledger, but it marked a turning point. Quality, once the obsession of the warehouse, had given way to volume. The workers noticed too. Where once a crate might be examined for hours, it now passed through in minutes. Theft became harder to track, but so did quality assurance. The system, once proud in its slowness, was learning to hurry and to forget. Many original tea warehouses had either shuttered or been absorbed into larger, more industrial depots. Crutched Friars was still in use, but only just. The East India Company, facing increasing scrutiny and legislative challenges, was beginning to crack. The days of monopoly were ending. In a sense, the tea warehouse had outlived its moment. Had served a society that prized measured trade and that viewed tea as a delicate and mysterious commodity. Now, tea was familiar. It was sold in tins with printed labels. It was boiled, sugared, spilt, and reheated. It was no longer a luxury, but a necessity. Yet somewhere behind the polished counters and cheerful packaging was a room with low ceilings and barred windows where a boy once tucked loose leaves into the lining of his cap. And so we are left to wonder, what happened to those workers, the invisible hands that created the empire's favorite drink? When tea became common, did their lives change? Or did they simply fade into the fog, like the steam rising from a morning cup? The warehouse stands empty now. By the 1840s, the brick walls of Crutched Friars had begun to flake. The paint on the doors peels. Iron locks rust beneath a fine coat of tea dust that has gathered from decades of sorting, weighing, and packing. In the rafters, pigeons nest where once paper lanterns hung. The sound that echoes in the space is not the creak of carts or the hiss of boiling kettles. It is silence, slow and unhurried. The tea warehouse, the hidden heart of Britain's tea obsession for over a century, is being decommissioned. Somewhere outside, in the noise of mid-19th century London, trains shriek on new rails. Tea now arrives not just by ship, but also by inland freight. It is whisked from Liverpool and Southampton to cities across the country in a fraction of the time it once took to unload it at a dock and store it for inspection. The East India Company, once master of this trade, has lost its monopoly. In 1834, it was formally stripped of its commercial privileges. The right to trade, tea once guarded, behind bricks and guards and ledgers, is now open to anyone with a ship, a supplier, and a merchant's ambition. What remains of the great warehouses are ghosts. Chalk marks on brick, initials carved into wooden beams, and shipping books thick with names long forgotten. And yet, even as the official trade routes evolve, and the tea itself begins to come, more and more from Assam and Darjeeling rather than Canton, a cultural afterimage lingers. You feel it in the strange reverence with which the British still speak of tea. It is no longer simply a drink. It is a ritual, a pause, a comfort. It is the reward at the end of a shift. It is the center of the table. It is what you offer in grief and joy, silence and conversation. The taste of that ritual was shaped by these warehouses. In the precise scales used to measure out the leaves, in the obsessive attention to packaging, in the guards who watched every movement, in the clerks who inked careful notes on moisture, levels and scent, in the boys who lifted crates until their backs gave out, in the men who lost their sense of smell to the bitter dust. Most of them never saw a tea plantation, never met a merchant, never sipped the leaves they handled. Yet, they were part of the chain. There is a tendency, when telling the history of empire, to focus on the ships and soldiers, the generals and governors. But what about the men who spent 40 years stacking crates in the damp? What about the woman who scrubbed the warehouse, floors with vinegar to keep down the rats? What about the boy caught sneaking leaves home for his sick mother? They are not listed in the company annals. Their faces do not appear in oil portraits. But, without them, the empire would not have tasted quite so strong. In time, most of the old tea warehouses were demolished. Some were turned into offices or grain storage. One briefly became a warehouse for foreign books. The smell of tea lingered in the beams for decades after the crates had gone. Visitors sometimes reported catching it in the air during renovations, a dry, dusty perfume of bergamot and brick. But the deeper legacy of the tea warehouses was cultural. The act of serving tea became a sign of gentility first among the aristocracy, then the merchant class, then factory families.
Afternoon tea.
Tea became institutionalized. The design of homes changed to accommodate tea trays and caddies. The very furniture of Britain shifted in response to a drink once locked in. Crates behind guarded doors. Even the idea of tea time, a uniquely British pause in the day, was born not in the drawing rooms of nobles, but in the clockwork logistics of trade. When the ships came in, when the crates were opened, when the leaves were fresh. And so, the warehouses, forgotten though they may be, live on in 1,000 daily. Gestures, the stirring of a spoon, the warming of a cup, the careful pour. We often forget that the rituals of today are shaped by the logistics of yesterday. If you were to walk now along the spot where crutched friars once stood, you might see nothing but a modern office or a car park. The stone markers are gone. The ledger books rest in archives few visit. The workers lie in unmarked graves. And yet, when someone adds just a little milk to the pot and waits for it to steep, they reenact a history written not in glory, but in crates. The next time you drink tea, pause and think of the path it took not across oceans or mountains, but across planks, onto backs, into chests, into musty halls, with locked doors and chalk-smudged walls. Think of the invisible hands. Stay and ask. When we remember empire, who do we remember it for? You are standing in a room filled with nothing but silence and ledgers. The year is 1395, and we are not in the bustling piazzas or glittering ballrooms of Venice, but deep inside the Palazzo dei Camerlenghi, one of the most underappreciated buildings of the Venetian Republic. Here, where light filters dimly through high windows, and the air smells faintly of ink and damp parchment, the salt accounts of an empire are kept. Salt, not silk, not gold, not spices. Salt. It is difficult now to imagine how much power a single mineral could hold over cities, trade routes, and even wars. But to truly understand the slow, meticulous bureaucracy that defined Venice's dominance in the Mediterranean, you must begin with this grainy white substance and the absurdly boring but powerful bureau that controlled it. Salt was more than a seasoning. In the medieval world, it was a preservative, a necessity for curing meat, storing fish, tanning hides, and treating wounds. In Venice ever, a city of shallow lagoons, tide-borne islands, and marshy trade ambition, knew this better than anyone. The Venetian state, perhaps more than any other in Europe, turned salt into an institution. As early as the 10th century, Venice had secured salt pans on the northern Adriatic coastline. By the 13th century, the state had begun monopolizing salt production and transport, gradually absorbing private pans and forbidding outside sales. By the time we reach the late 14th century, salt is no longer just a commodity. It is state revenue. It is national policy. It is what funds the navy, the roads, and the scribes and, perhaps more importantly, what keeps regional rivals in check. The office responsible was known as the Proveditore al Sal, or the Salt Supervisors. These men were not glamorous. Their duties included overseeing shipments, checking evaporation levels in pans, inspecting barrels for leakage, verifying brine density with awkward tools, and most crucially maintaining a sprawling network of ledgers so complete that even the flow of brine in some distant marsh might be recorded with solemn precision. And yet it is here in the humdrum work of the Salt Office that Venice engineered one of the most quietly brilliant political tools. In its arsenal, the imposed salt route. Venice did not simply sell salt. It controlled how, where, and to whom salt could be sold. Every city-state, feudal fief, and coastal village under its influence was required to purchase a fixed quota of salt no more, no less at a state-determined price. Cities such as Bergamo, Brescia, and Padua found themselves bound not by chains, but by contracts. They were required to buy salt from Venice, even if cheaper or closer supplies were available. Even the quantities were often arbitrary. If a hillside town consumed only 3 barrels of salt per year, but Venice required it to buy 5, it must do so anyway. Excess salt rotted in warehouses, peasants paid the price, but the system held. Why would these cities agree to such terms? Because Venice was rarely threatened with swords, it was threatened with silence. Cities that refused their quotas found their trade blocked, their grain shipments stalled, their merchants turned away from Venetian ports. Venice had engineered a supply chain so dominant, so interlocked, that to displease its salt bureaucrats was to court economic suffocation. It was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of logistical coercion. But beneath this cold efficiency was something else: resentment. Salt may have preserved meat, but it also preserved grudges. By the late 1300s, murmurs of discontent began to rise. In the mainland towns, the city of Ferrara, strategically located and ambitious, quietly began discussing alternative supply routes with the Papal States. In the hills around Padua, rumors spread of smuggled salt from Lombardy. Local cartels began to hide barrels in hay carts, disguising their origin with forged seals. The Venetian response was swift but dulged, as it always was. They issued more ledgers. They increased inspections. They reassigned particularly meticulous scribes to outposts along salt roads, where oxen moved no faster than 3 miles per hour, and each barrel had to be inventoried by weight, date, and origin. You might imagine that a salt war would involve battles. Instead, it involved paper. In one account from 1398, minor clerk in Chioggia caught wind of an illicit shipment of Modenese salt moving through a back canal. He did not raise a flag or send a message to the Doge. Instead, he opened a new ledger and wrote with maddening calm a 3-page note comparing the density of the contraband salt to that of standard Venetian issue. That report took 6 weeks to reach the Salt Council, who promptly filed it, not under contraband or enforcement, but under anomalies in shipment behavior. This was the Venetian way: control through boredom, power through the process. To resist Venice was not to face military conquest, but to enter a Kafkaesque spiral of documentation. Fines, restrictions, and inspections so suffocating that most cities simply surrendered to the system. It is in this spirit that the so-called Salt War with Ferrara began in 1304, not with a shot, but with a refusal to honor a salt quota. Ferrara had aligned itself with the Papal States and, in a rather bold act, decided to open its own salt pans along the Po River, cutting Venice out entirely. The response was a diplomatic crisis. Not because salt production threatened Venice's military dominance, but because it violated the mathematical harmony of its ledgers. To this day, Venetian documents from the time do not describe Ferrara's act as rebellion. They describe it as an unauthorized recalibration of expected salinization volumes. It would be 3 years before troops moved. By that point, Venetian ships had already blockaded Ferrara's salt pans, redirected trade around its ports, and flooded its markets. With heavily subsidized salt driving prices so low that the local salt business collapsed. What you see here is not brute force, but systemic strangulation. And so you might ask, how much salt is too much salt? That, in Venice, was always the wrong question. The better question was, who decides? The answer was always the same: the ledger. The weight of salt was less important than the weight of paper tracking it. A single entry, carefully inked in some cold chamber of the salt office, could doom a town's economy. The ledgers did not just reflect reality, they created it. Even today, long after Venice's maritime power faded, you can find those ledgers in dusty archives filled with numbers and signatures. Their binding is cracked, their pages faded. But in their calm, obsessive columns lies the memory of a state that built its empire not on gold or fire, but on salt and the patience to track it. And if salt made food last longer, could it make power last longer too? As you step once more into the cool, dimly lit corridors of the Palazzo dei Camerlenghi in the year 1402, the air hums, not with the scratch of quill on parchment, but with whispered negotiations, half-hidden entrances, and coins passing quietly from palm to palm. The salt office, once the realm of solemn scribes jotting down evaporation rates and barrel counts, has become a theater for subtle intrigue and private persuasion. You follow a narrow hallway, its walls lined with rows of ledgers bound in leather, so dark they appear almost black. Beyond a larched doorway, a small side chamber has been set up. 2 chairs, a battered table, and a single oil lamp whose flickering light throws long shadows on the stone floor. Here, the Proveditore al Salwan, of Venice's most powerful, but least known officials, sees his most discreet clients. It is said that a single well-timed gift of salt could grease the wheels of commerce more effectively than a squadron of galleys. Officials in distant towns learnt this quickly. If an envoy from Brescia approached the salt office seeking a reduction in salt quotas, or simply a reprieve on the date his payment was due, he would be advised by a clerk that unforeseen difficulties might be softened by an offering of silver coins or an invitation to dine at the DOJ's table. Subtlety was key. A note in a ledger might read olive oil gifted for cordial relations. Both parties would understand that. Olive oil was a thinly veiled reference to the sack of gold ducats hidden under the veneer of a commonplace charitable act. This web of favors and payoffs extended far beyond the walls of the Palazzo dei Camerlenghi. Consider the journey of a single barrel of salt destined for Padua. It left the salt pans of Chioggia marked with a government seal, and then passed through a flotilla of shallow draft boats up the Brenta Canal. At each lock, a local official stamped the barrel's tally card. A coin discreetly slipped into a clerk's hand might guarantee a favorable reading, perhaps an allowance for extra weight, or a note that the barrel's brine content was within acceptable limits, despite obvious damp rot. These marginal adjustments, recorded in precise ink, translated into significant profit margins for merchants and extra revenue for local magistrates. At the heart of this arrangement was the concept of agioth, premium one paid to secure privileges within a regulated market. In the salt trade, agio became a euphemism for the cost of doing business. When Padua's demand for salt spiked because of a particularly fruitful season of cheese-making, Padua's governor would imply to his Venetian counterpart that a small token of appreciation would ensure early delivery. The token might be 50 ducats or 500 depending on the stakes. Once the payment was agreed upon, the transaction was entered in the margin of a ledger under a coded phrase such as spedizione in tempi ordinary shipment within normal times. And no further questions were asked. Yet while these side deals greased commerce, they also eroded the integrity of the system. With every bribe quietly logged and every inspector quietly paid off, the salt office's reputation as the paragon of bureaucratic rigor began to blur. In 1405, a scathing report drafted by a visiting ambassador from Mantua complained that the cords of Venice's salt laws hang not on spits and scales, but on the lining of gentlemen's sleeves. The ambassador's words found their way into Venetian archives, not as a cause for reform, but as a curiosity, a footnote in an otherwise unbroken series of entries. As a merchant or nobleman of the era, you would come to accept these practices. As part of daily life, refusal to pay a customary olio di cortesia courtesy oil would mean delays in shipment, greased inspections, or sudden administrative oversights, such as lost permits that had to be reissued at a premium. Even religious institutions, like the monasteries that toasted each other with salted wine over a gala feast, would quietly set aside a portion of their treasury to maintain goodwill with the salt office, lest their annual allotment of salt for preserving olives be unceremoniously reduced. And yet bribery alone does not tell the full story. In the same years, when illicit payments became routine, the Venetian government also introduced reforms partly to curb corruption, partly to sharpen its own profits. A new law in 1407 standardized the instruments used to measure brine density, a hydrometer of precise shape, sealed by the state stamp. All incoming barrels had to be tested using this device. Any deviation, even of a single degree, triggered an entry in a deficiency register and a fine equal to twice the value of the missing salt. The law's ostensible purpose was to root out dishonest merchants, but it also provided new leverage for those who knew how to navigate the fine print. Wealthy suppliers commissioned their own hydrometers identical to the official ones and practiced secret calibrations in hidden workshops. They offered free testing services to low-level clerks, another form of bribery, so that when their barrels reached the grand hall of the salt office, the official hydrometer agreed with the private one. In this twist of legislation, Venice unwittingly created a new market for precision instruments and yet another channel for discreet payments. As the trade grew more complex, so too did the architecture of bribery. In 1410, a network known colloquially among merchants as the Compagnia del Sale, the Salt Company, emerged. It was neither sanctioned by Venice nor strictly illegal. It operated in the gray zone between regulation and subversion. Its members were seasoned traders, lawyers, and sometimes former salt office clerks who had quietly resigned with their knowledge intact. They served as intermediaries, guaranteeing clients smooth passage of goods in exchange for fees that were, if anything, more transparent than the old backdoor arrangements. A merchant might pay a flat 5% to the Compagnia, rather than calculate individual fees to multiple clerks. In return, he received a single composite document, a greenback certificate of expedited compliance, which expedited his shipments through every checkpoint, official or private. While the Compagnia del Sale satisfied the needs of large-scale traders, it also drew the ire of smaller players. Local salt producers in the Po Valley, who had always been subject to Venetian quotas, complained that the company's fees put them at a disadvantage. They lacked the capital to pay the upfront cost, and so their salt moved more slowly, fetched lower prices, and sometimes spoilt in warehouses awaiting inspection. This tension between centralized power in Venice, large-scale traders, and small-scale producers led to occasional flare-ups that looked on the surface like open rebellion, but were really battles over accounting codes. In 1415, producers in the Rovigo district staged a sit-down protest at the Rialto lock, refusing to allow any barrels to pass until the salt office agreed to reconsider certain surtaxes. Their surrender came not with swords drawn, but with a letter signed by a delegation of monks, merchants, and artisans in appeal for equitable ledger entries and reasonable timescales. The office, fearing both the optics of a blockade and the erosion of its own revenues, agreed to review the surtax codes and even published a revised schedule of fees, though merchants noted afterward that the new codes were so labyrinthine that few could understand them without hiring a specialized scribe. It is in these moments that you recognize how Venice wielded the ledger as both cudgel and shield. When small producers challenged unfair fees, Venice would promise transparencies, then bury them under a new layer of procedural complexity. When large traders threatened to circumvent the state's monopoly, Venice would tighten regulations and create new offices to enforce them, staffed by officials chosen for their loyalty rather than their candor. By the end of Section 2, you can see how the Salt Office had become something more than a bureaucratic outpost. It was a living organism, evolving through cycles of legislation, bribery, and reform. Its power lay as much in its ability to adapt as in its capacity to endure. The ledgers did more than record transactions. They shaped them. Contracts were written to fit the entries, and policies were crafted around the needs of both the state and the merchant. Yet, for all this adaptation, the Salt Office faced a challenge that no amount of bribery or notebook lining could solve. It was at the mercy of human fallibility. Clerks grew weary, charts went missing, pens ran dry, the same meticulous. Records that sustained Venice's salt empire could, if lost or destroyed, unravel it. So, when the great flood of 1423 crept through the canals and spilt into the lower rooms of the Palazzo dei Camerlinghi, submerging ledgers under brackish water, it posed the ultimate threat. It's not the loss of salt, but the loss of memory. Happened when those pages, detailing decades of quotas, bribes, and covert agreements, were soaked into illegibility. How did Venice survive when its own story, as recorded in ink, was nearly washed away? It was sometime in late autumn of 1423 when the rain began to fall with a stubborn insistence. In Venice, rain alone was never cause for alarm. The city was built on water, after all. But this time the tides came with an eerie persistence, pressing higher against the sea gates, seeping up through the drains of the Campi and flooding the stone steps of the bridges. Locals called it acqua alta, a term already familiar to the salt porters and fishermen who knew which way the water lapped across different neighborhoods. But this was no ordinary acqua alta. In the dim archives beneath the Palazzo dei Camerlinghi were centuries of salt quotas, bribe records, and shipping contracts were carefully stored. The water rose above the ankles of junior clerks before anyone thought to rescue the documents. By the time an order came to elevate the ledgers to higher floors, the lower shelves had already been soaked. Bats floated in the corners. Ink ran in wavy, spidery lines, washing away names, numbers, signatures, and judgments. It was a bureaucratic nightmare unlike anything Venice had experienced before. You can imagine a room normally filled with the steady scratching of quills, now eerily silent. Damp parchment hung from drying lines like defeated banners. Workers moved among them with the care of surgeons, lifting pages, comparing warped texts to copies from memory. Some clerks cried openly. Others attempted to redraw the damage, an almost impossible task when no one could remember whether the salt shipment of 1418 to Vicenza had included an adjustment for flood damages or whether the exemption granted to the monastery of San Giorgio had been temporary or permanent. In a government where documentation was law and ink equaled truth, the disappearance of written memory was not just a logistical problem, it was a philosophical one. How could justice, tax, and truth be preserved when the record had literally dissolved? The Salt Office, proud bastion of ledger-driven governance, now faced a decision: pretend the records still held their former weight, or begin rebuilding. From a framework of speculation, oral testimony, and cautious forgery, they chose a bit of both. First came the verification commissioner, hastily assembled team of scribes. Merchants and minor nobles tasked with reconstituting the memory of the Salt Office. Their work began not with the archives, but with interviews. Gray-haired salt. Clerks were summoned to the Palazzo's high chambers and asked what they remembered from decades past. But do you recall how many barrels were dispatched to Bergamo in the winter of 1409? Did Signore Alvise Morosine ever pay the brine tax adjustment? Was it 1 ducat per cento or 2 for monastic exemptions in Ferrara? Each answer was written down, then compared with any remaining fragment of documentation. When conflicts arose, when memories clashed or overlapped, the commission took a vote, and that vote became fact. A small rubber seal was created for these decisions, square block with the image of a broken amphora, to denote that the ruling had been reconstructed from calamity. One might assume this process would bring clarity or closure. Instead, it created new opportunities for manipulation. The memory-based system offered a fresh opening for those eager to adjust the past. Noble families brought forward their own scribes who offered witnessed recollections of favorable tax exemptions. Some monasteries, too, discovered lost privileges they claimed had once been granted by the Doge himself. Copies of copies of letters, some real, others obviously touched up, were presented as evidence. Each document was accompanied by eloquent appeals to tradition, loyalty to the Republic, or the particular hardships suffered during the flood. In theory, These documents were scrutinized by the Verification Commission. In practice, they were often rubber-stamped and entered into the newly rebuilt ledgers under a separate category. Memoranda pro tempore perdita, entries from the time of loss. But even this tidy Latin euphemism couldn't hide what was really happening, a quiet reinvention of the salt economy, reshaped by whoever could tell the best story or afford the best advocate. And so, the salt office slipped into a period of graceful disintegration. Outwardly, the routines remained the same. The bell still rang at noon. Ships still docked at Chioggia and unloaded their barrels with due ceremony. The clerks still wore their woolen robes and kept to their benches, but the foundations had changed. Trust in the ledgers had diminished. More deals were made in person. More salt changed hands off book, wrapped in linen sacks, and carried through unlit alleyways to avoid the taxman. By the 1430s, whispers of the office's fading relevance began to circulate among the merchant elite. Some traders quietly began dealing in foreign salt from Sardinia or North Africa salt that was coarser, less white, but considerably cheaper. These illegal shipments were camouflaged among legal goods, bribing inspectors to overlook telltale signs of non-Venetian origin. The Republic, recognizing the slow leak in its monopoly, responded with a strategy that felt almost ritualistic. It doubled down on bureaucracy. A new division within the salt office was created, the Officio della Purificazione, Office of Purification, tasked with certifying the Venetian origin of every grain of salt. Their work was thorough, but slow, and the growing delays further. Encouraged to offer cord trade, eventually, even honest merchants found themselves complicit in small lies. They purchased certified salt to keep on display at docks while shipping cheaper foreign salt under tarps. And so Venice found itself caught in a familiar trap, over-regulating the present to compensate for a past that no longer fully existed. Where once the city had controlled the flow of salt with ledgers and legal codes, it now relied on rituals, ceremonies, and a growing pile of contradictory recovered records. But perhaps the most profound change was not commercial but cultural. For centuries, the salt office had embodied the Venetian ideal, that the Republic could shape the world through calculation, diligence, and the written word. The ledgers were its proudest tools, more sacred than swords, more binding than royal decrees. But when the waters rose and the ink ran, it exposed something uncomfortable, that even the most meticulous bureaucracy is vulnerable to forces beyond its control. Clerks began to view their own work differently. Once, each column of numbers had been sacred. Now every entry carried the silent weight of doubt. Some began inserting quiet marks, asterisks, double dashes, small sketches of waves beside, entries that had been reconstructed from memory. These became known as annotazione d'acqua, or water notations, symbols of the office's uncertain truths. Despite this quiet unraveling, the salt office did not vanish. It endured. As a perfect machine, but as a flawed human institution sustained by tradition and inertia more than effectiveness. Its grandeur faded. Its halls grew dustier. By the time visiting Dutch envoys wrote of it in the 1470s, they described it as a place where history is counted in rusting locks and yellowed paper, where the clerks speak of floods more than salt. And yet even then, salt continued to move, was still traded, taxed, and argued over. Families still measured their wealth and how much salt they controlled. Monasteries still pickled fish in its brine. Children in the back streets of Venice still licked the salt blocks hung from carts, tasting the legacy of centuries of control. In this way, the salt office lived on not through perfect ledgers or unbroken chains of paperwork, but through the habits and rituals of a city built on salt. By the end of the 15th century, the Republic began shifting more power to new commodities, pepper, silk, and spices. But the old salt office, now a relic of an earlier age, was kept alive more as a monument than a necessity. It housed records no one read anymore. It's overseen by clerks who took pride in their fading art. The flood of 1423 was remembered not as a disaster, but as a quiet turning point, the moment when Venice ceased to believe that ink could hold back the tide. So the story ends not with collapse or conquest, but with a kind of melancholy endurance. The building still standing, ledgers still drying on wooden shelves, a few faithful scribes scratching away in the dim lamplight. They write not because their records will last, but because writing is what they have always done. And as you drift away into sleep, picture one of those clerks gently closing a leather-bound ledger at the end of a long day, dipping his fingers into a small clay bowl of salt beside him, and whispering a prayer not to the sea, but to the permanence of memory. If you were to walk through the narrow streets of Bruges in the early 1700s, you might notice a sound that was easy to miss, but impossible to forget. The soft, rapid clicking of bobbins, as tiny wooden tools flicked with astonishing speed, were wielded by women and girls sitting by open windows or on low stools in drafty attics. The threads they guided danced over stiffened pillows covered with pins, complex patterns held in place by nothing more than habit, skill, and the muscle. Memory of generations. This was lace-making in Bruges, a city that, by the dawn of the 18th century, turned this delicate handicraft into an industrial obsession. Lace was more than a fashion statement. It was a mark of rank, a symbol of civility, and a signal of taste. In courtrooms and ballrooms across Europe, noble collars rose like white waves. Embroidered handkerchiefs flashed like banners, and entire fortunes were wrapped up in ruffles and cuffs. And though lace might appear light and airy, it was backed by one of the densest bureaucratic structures of the Ancien regime. Tax codes, guild regulations, and export restrictions wrapped tighter than any corset. In Bruges, lace was regulated by the Confrérie des Denteliers, the Guild of Lace Makers. It's an arteries-old organization that controlled every thread and tool within the city walls. To produce lace legally, a woman had to be registered with the guild. She had to work within authorized hours, submit to inspections, and use only approved patterns. These rules applied not just to professional lace makers, but to widows, orphans, and housewives who wove in secret to afford candles or bread. The Guild Hall, a squat stone building off the Rue Haute, kept meticulous records. Each member's output was weighed, measured, and taxed. It was said that the guildmasters could tell, by the angle of a loop, whether a piece had been made on a Tuesday or a Sunday. While this was likely exaggerated, the guild's reach was absolute. It dictated what could be sold to whom and at what price. But power breeds pressure, and pressure eventually leads to rebellion. The trouble began, as trouble often does, with war. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, had drained the economies of Western Europe. Troops moved across Flanders, like storm clouds, requisitioning supplies, trampling fields, and choking trade routes. Lace exports to France, a major consumer of Flemish goods, fell sharply due to embargoes and shifting alliances. The market contracted. Prices dipped. In response, the Lace Guild did not relax restrictions to help struggling workers. Instead, it tightened them. Fearing an influx of unlicensed lace flooding the city and driving down market value, the Guild increased inspections and raised registration fees. More damningly, the city council, pressured by merchants, introduced the thread tax, a seemingly minor tariff that levied a charge on each spool of linen or silk thread purchased within Bruges. On paper, the tax was insignificant, just a few deniers per ounce. In reality, it sliced deep into already thin margins. For independent lace makers, particularly women supporting households on thread and patience alone, the new levy was catastrophic. Soon, whispers spread through the tenements and alleyways of Bruges. Widows began pooling money to buy untaxed thread from itinerant vendors. Girls in the convent schools were taught not only to make lace, but to hide it inside bread ovens, beneath floorboards, in the lining of prayer books. Lace smugglers, once rare, now formed quiet networks, operating under the noses of churchmen and constables. It was not a dramatic uprising, at least not. At first, there were no barricades, no fiery declarations, and no pamphlets printed in secret presses. Instead, there was a strange kind of civil disobedience woven directly into fabric. Women began encoding hidden messages into their lace, a certain twist of thread to represent a band design, a sequence of knots spelling out initials of tax protesters. These patterns were known as dentelles moots, silent lace, and they traveled across Europe undetected by all but the most trained eyes. Authorities, of course, eventually noticed. By 1716, several arrests had been made. The punishment for evading the thread tax or producing black market lace varied. Some women were fined, others were whipped publicly. A few were forced to wear iron bobbins around their necks as a mark of shame. These bobbins were clumsy replicas, more symbolic than painful, but heavy enough to make everyday life difficult. They knocked against the chest and clattered in church pews. They were meant to humiliate. Still, resistance persisted. Why? Because lace was more than a livelihood. For many in Bruges, it was identity. Girls began lace making at the age of 7 or 8, apprenticed to family members or convents. Entire genealogies of skill passed down through the thrum of bobbins and the whispered wisdom of grandmothers. To forbid La Sorte or restrict it to the terms of the guild was to erase history. This led to one of the more curious developments of the revolt, the rise of lace monasteries. Officially, these were ordinary religious houses, Carmelites, Beguines, and Ursulines tasked with spiritual formation. But many became covert lace workshops, training poor women in the pure styles of Flanders, using smuggled thread and forbidden designs. These monasteries sold their work to foreign merchants through coded ledgers, where lace was listed as altar cloths or pilgrim linens. Some bishops turned a blind eye. Others actively supported the work, viewing it as a way to preserve Flemish culture and protect women from starvation. The city's guild, naturally, viewed these monasteries as nests of heretical rebellion. Tensions rose. Investigations were ordered. But when friars appeared to inspect the convent lacework, they often left with gifts tucked in their sleeve samples of lace so fine, so intricate, that they dared not challenge the hands that made them. As the decade wore on, a strange, kind of double economy took hold in Bruges. On the surface, lace remained a regulated commodity, taxed, weighed, and measured. Beneath that surface, a vibrant underground lace market thrived. Thread passed hand to hand in midnight courtyards. Patterns were whispered rather than drawn. Guild agents were bribed, misled, or on occasion, converted. One particularly telling incident occurred in 1721. A guild official named Frederick Van Keppel was assigned to inspect suspected contraband lace in the southern district. When he entered the home of a widow named Adele Verhoeven, he found not just lace but a ledger detailing years of unlicensed production. He was prepared to arrest her, but she offered him a compromise, a single lace collar made from a pattern, lost since the previous century, passed down through her grandmother. He took the collar and left without reporting her. 2 months later, he resigned from his post. A year after that, he opened a small lace shop outside city limits, free from guild jurisdiction. His quiet erosion of authority didn't go unnoticed by the ruling council. Yet they were reluctant to crush the rebellion entirely. Why? Because even illegal lace was still Bruges lace. And in the cutthroat world of international trade, reputation mattered more than regulation. Foreign buyers didn't care how a collar was made, only that it came from the famed lace makers of Flanders. By the mid-1720s, the city council made a subtle shift. Rather than enforce the thread tax through fines and floggings, they introduced a new policy: amnesty by excellence. Under this rule, any piece of unlicensed lace judged to be of exceptional quality would be exempt from penalty. And it was a bureaucratic surrender, dressed as sophistication. But for the women of Bruges, it was a partial victory. Now quality could protect them where legality once failed. Lacemakers began taking greater risks, producing bolder patterns, using rarer threads, and submitting their work for review under false names. The guild remained intact, but its authority was fragmented. The thread tax was eventually repealed, replaced by a broader import duty that targeted foreign lace instead. The revolt never received a name, no single leader, and no monument in the public square. But for decades after, Bruges lace bore a hidden signature, a cluster of loops, 3, rose from the edge, stitched in a whisper of gray. It was a mark passed from mother to daughter, teacher to student, a reminder that even the smallest rebellion, when woven patiently and worn with pride, could reshape the fabric of history. And so, in a city known for silent canals and meticulous craftsmanship, the quiet defiance of thread and bobbin still echoed long after the laws had faded. By the late 1720s, what had begun as an invisible protest, silent lace, and untaxed thread had evolved into a fully realized counterculture beneath the cobblestones of Bruges. The underground lace economy no longer operated only in fear or desperation. It had taken on the traits of a hidden guild in its own right, codified signals. Loyalty oaths, safe houses, and apprenticeships passed through whispered networks. The bobbins themselves became more than tools. They became messages. Each lace maker traditionally kept her own set of bobbins, carved from bone or wood, polished smooth from years of use. But during the height of the lace tax revolt, many women began altering these tools, subtle engraving symbols, notches, or initials known only within the circle. A scalloped line might signal a trader who smuggled silk from Lille. A starburst etched near the base of the handle could indicate a pattern outlawed by the guild. Some even carried bobbins with hidden compartments, designed to hold slips of thread or paper patterns. There is an 18th century account from a French merchant named Jacques Lemoyne, who described a bizarre encounter with a lace trader in Bruges. She wore a large wool shawl and sat in a tavern corner working with deliberate slowness. When she noticed him watching, she paused, raised one bobbin, and gently tapped the side of her nose before handing him a strip of lace wrapped in onion paper. The message was clear. This was no ordinary purchase. The strip, he unwrapped later, was exquisiting, illegal. It was through these quiet exchanges that a new class of entrepreneur emerged in Bruges, the lace runners. They were not the lace makers themselves, nor the merchants at the city gates. They operated in between, usually young women who knew the safe routes, who could pass unnoticed between convent walls and foreign carriages. They carried their goods tucked into sleeves, baskets of apples, or false-bottomed boxes labeled spiritual instruction. Some even disguised their deliveries as charitable visits, wearing veils and rosaries, hiding the contraband among loaves of bread or small religious icons. The race runners learned to navigate more than just the physical streets. They understood human terrain, which priests could be trusted, which city guards turned a blind eye, and which wives of wealthy aldermen discreetly commissioned lace for parties they swore were patriotic. Still, the underground network was not without its risks. A raid in 1727 on a convent in the Eastern District revealed a stockpile of lace worth over 500 florins, equivalent to a year's wages for a skilled tradesman. The abbess claimed ignorance. Younger sisters refused to speak. After 2 days of interrogation, a novice finally confessed that the lace had been created by girls from the orphanage. Trained secretly by one of the older nuns, the lace was then sold to pay for food and candles. The city was outraged not at the illegal place, but at the revelation that orphans had been exploited in this way. Public sentiment, which had once leaned cautiously toward the guild's authority, began to shift more openly in favor of the lace makers. The narrative changed. No longer were they seen as lawbreakers, but as defenders of local craft, protectors of tradition against cold bureaucracy. Some of the most powerful families in Bruges began quietly supporting these women, purchasing lace off the books for their wives and daughters, or turning a blind eye when an aunt or cousin accidentally hired an unregistered lace worker. It became something of a polite fiction. Everyone knew the lace was contraband, but as long as it was worn at the right church, in the right pew, on the right shoulder, no one would say so aloud. The true genius of the movement, however, lay in its use of pattern as both defiance and communication. Lace patterns in the 18th century were often memorized rather than drawn, especially among working-class women. Visual patterns were sometimes copied from existing lace or passed on orally through mnemonic songs or rhymes. But during the revolt, the creation of false patterns, decoy patterns, submitted to guild authorities, became a subtle art. These harmless-looking designs were often filed with inspectors, while the real patterns were worked on in secret and handed down from trusted mentors. Many of these real patterns contained layers of encoded meaning. A floral border with 7 leaves might represent the number of children a widow had to support. A spiral motif in the corner could signify the initials of the maker. Entire stories were embedded into lace cuffs and collars, stories of hardship, survival, memory, and subtle protest. There is one recorded piece, dated to 1732, housed in a museum in Ghent, known only as the Weeping Willow. At first glance, it is a typical ecclesiastical edging fine linen lace, meant for altar cloths. But closer inspection reveals a hidden detail. The tree's leaves are shaped like small teardrops, and in the border are dozens of minute figures, kneeling, weeping, and sewing. Scholars now believe it was made in honor of women punished under the thread tax, a silent eulogy encoded in needle and thread. Such subtle artistry was not lost on foreign collectors. English and Spanish nobility began seeking out Flemish lace. That bore this rebellious quality works considered more authentic than the uniform guild-sanctioned pieces. This demand created new smuggling routes from Bruges into Antwerp, Ghent, and Calais. Lace was sewn into corset linings, wrapped in wool, or packed into barrels of dried herbs. Some merchants even used funeral processions' coffins, sealed and unquestioned as vehicles to transport lace across borders. In a particularly strange episode recorded in the papers of the Bruges City Council, a coffin bound for Liel was found to contain no body at all, just layers upon layers of lace, rolled tight and dusted with chalk to mimic the weight and feel of a corpse. This blurred line between legality and art, trade and rebellion, created a cultural shift. By the early 1730s, lace-making had become a quiet, feminist revolution. It wasn't about slogans or riots. It was about reclaiming a skill dismissed as domestic and wielding it as an economic force. Women who had little voice in public life, who could not vote, petition, or own property freely, could nevertheless influence culture, fashion, and even policy through the threads they tied in. Solitude. Men in power noticed. Some reacted by doubling down, expanding inspections, raiding convents, and enforcing curfews. Others, particularly younger bureaucrats, saw an opportunity. They proposed reforms, a free lace charter which would allow independent production outside guild rules, provided it met quality standards. Though controversial, the idea gained traction. One of the more notable advocates was Cornelis van Aert, a minor official in the Textile Bureau who proposed licensing independent lace schools. He argued, in a quiet but persuasive voice, that the city would benefit more from exporting excellent lacery, regardless of origin, than from punishing its most talented creators. Van Aert's proposal was met with suspicion, but he gained support from wealthy merchant families who had long operated in the gray areas of the lace economy. Within a few years, a compromise was reached, the Lace Waiver Act of 1734. Under this act, certain lace makers could apply for a waiver that allowed them to operate outside guild jurisdiction if they could prove hardship or lineage in the craft. The act required public demonstration of skill, submission of 2 sample pieces, and a nominal fee. It was not universal. It was not entirely fair, but it was something. Dozens of women lined up outside the guild hall in the spring of 1735, some elderly, others with babies strapped to their back seats, holding bundles of lace, fingers calloused, eyes quietly defiant. In the following year, records show a modest but significant increase in registered lace exports. The underground economy did not disappear overnight, but it was no longer forced to live entirely in the shadows. Still, some questions lingered. Would the reforms hold, or would the guild reassert its dominance? Would new taxes replace the old? Would the artistry and symbolism embedded in silent lace be preserved or forgotten in the rush toward market efficiency? And more poignantly, for the women who had woven resistance into fabric, who had spent their youth tying thousands of knots in secret, half-starved and half-proud what had been gained. What had been lost? The summer of 1735 brought with it a peculiar quiet. To Bruges is not the quiet of resignation or defeat, but the kind that settles after a long, stormy season. The Lace Waiver Act had not dissolved the tensions between the city guilds and the lace workers, but it had transformed them. There were fewer raids, fewer shuttered homes, and fewer fines delivered in the early morning hours. That was enough. It was not justice exactly, but it was a kind of survival. In the narrow lanes of Bruges, lace was still made in the same way it had been for generations by daylight, by candlelight, by women hunched in small chairs beside windows, their feet wrapped in worn wool, fingers never idle. They no longer flinched at every knock. The bobbins clattered again without fear. The lace itself changed subtly in these years. Many historians point to the decade after 1735 as a period of stylistic experimentation in Flemish lace. With the loosening of guild control and the influx of diverse influences through smuggling channels, lace patterns began to reflect a blend of rural and urban motifs, religious and secular themes, and local innovations. Floral designs became more wild and uncontained. Geometric borders softened. Animals previously banned from most ecclesiastical lace began to appear in miniature birds, lambs and foxes tucked into corners or hidden in curls of thread. A new school of lace emerged, freehand Bruges, so called because it allowed for more improvisation in design, where the guild had once required strict adherence to approved patterns. Some waver holders now took liberties, modifying known styles with personal flourishes. Leaf might curl differently. A cross might hide a name. For the first time in over a century, lace from Bruges became identifiably individual. This shift was subtle, but to the trained eye, it was revolutionary. Lace collectors in Paris and Venice began to remark on the difference. Some even preferred the so-called untamed style of Bruges to the more rigid lace of Normandy or Milan. Letters from French merchants described this new style as alive and unpredictable, with patterns like spoken thoughts made visible. Within Bruges itself, these stylistic shifts also created room for new kinds of lace makers, not only women born into lace families, but widows, former domestic servants, and even some men who had once served as pattern drafters or bobbin carvers. With the guild no longer holding an absolute monopoly, the boundaries of who could participate in the craft softened. In 1737, a public exhibition of lace was held in the outer cloister of the St. Salvator's Cathedral. It was meant as a demonstration of the city's restored unity, a token gesture that the conflict had passed. Guild representatives walked side by side with waver holders. The lace displayed was anonymous. Each strip, collar, or edging bore only a small number and a tag noting its style and thread count. And yet, beneath this gesture of reconciliation, subtle rivalries lingered. Guild lace still held pride, a place intricately woven, starched, and perfect. But those in the know spent longer before the freehand pieces. They leaned closer, whispered to each other, and tried to guess the maker. Some were thought to be from the elusive convent workshops. Others bore telltale asymmetries, little imperfections that spoke not of error, but of haste, secrecy, or deliberate rebellion. One piece in particular drew quiet murmurs. It was an altar trim of fine linen thread, no more than 3 inches wide, bearing a repeated motif of 2 birds circling a tower. No known pattern matched it. An elderly nun was seen standing before it, her lips moving silently. The piece was never claimed. In the years that followed, the free lace movement settled into the fabric of Bruges' economic life. It never fully supplanted the guild. Rather, it coexisted in a kind of uneasy balance, regulated, but looser, taxed, but with exemptions, monitored, but not hunted. Some of the early leaders of the revolt faded into obscurity. Others became quiet legends. Lieve de Nert, who had once smuggled silk in her baby's swaddling clothes, died in 1742, with 5 silver bobbins tucked in a drawer and a note that read, "Not one, not wasted." Her eldest daughter continued her work, operating a small school in the North Quarter for orphan girls who wanted to learn lace. Cornelis von Aerde, the bureaucrat who championed the Waiver Act, went on to draft several minor trade reforms and died in relative obscurity. His name appears in footnotes, but in one surviving letter. He wrote of the lace tax era, "We tried to tax a whisper and it taught us to listen, but the true legacy of the lace tax revolt is less visible. It is not in the laws passed or the patterns preserved. It is in the memory of how women, largely unseen by history, shaped their world through sheer repetition, through thread and patience and refusal. A modern historian once described the revolt as a resistance made of softness. There were no riots, no broken windows. Instead, there were thousands of hours of silent work, dozens of lives appended by attacks no one could enforce without shame. And in that soft, slow resistance, something changed. The thread became political. For much of history, textiles had been the domain of women spinning, weaving, and embroidering, dismissed as decorative, domestic, and unworthy of serious record. But in Bruges, for a brief time, thread became power. It was smuggled. It was taxed, it was banned and coveted and hidden and displayed. Rules that bound it, the women of Bruges claimed a form of authorship that few of their contemporaries could even name. In later decades, the lace industry would shift again. Machines would eventually arrive. Bobbin lace would give way to needle. Lace and, eventually, to industrial embroidery. By the mid-19th century, most of the handmade lace economy had been reduced to tourist curios and antique shows. But the stories survived in part because they were told in lace itself. Museums today hold a handful of surviving examples from the period. Cuffs bearing birds and towers, altar lace with strange, sorrowful patterns, and collars stitched with initials too small for any official to notice. Each piece is a document of sorts, not a decree or edict, but a lived record, tied in knots and patterns and secrets. In the hushed light of a display case, they may seem delicate, irrelevant, and quaint, but they carry the memory of thousands of women who defied erasure, not by shouting, but by stitching. And if you look closely enough, you might still see them silent, bent to their task. Eyes tired but unwavering, making lace for bread, for dignity, for defiance. So we are left to wonder how many other quiet revolts have gone unrecorded. Because they failed, but because they succeeded in precisely the way history forgets best, softly, completely, and without permission. You are standing on a small island, green, windswept, covered in mossy rocks and low shrubs. It's June 1859, and the Pacific air carries with it the scent of seaweed and fir trees. The island is called San Juan. It lies in the Salish Sea, tucked between the northwesternmost tip of what was then called Washington Territory and the southern reaches of Vancouver Island. British North America, what today is part of Canada. At first glance, this island appears remote, even forgotten. But here, in the calm stillness of this northern spring, one of the strangest and quietest international incidents in history begins with the sound of a squealing pig. The pig belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company, a powerful British colonial trading corporation that functioned as a de facto government across much of Canada. The company had a farm on San Juan Island, operated by Charles Griffin, who raised sheep, pigs, and potatoes to support the company's local operations. The pig, a rotund black Berkshire, had a habit of wandering. Not far from Griffin's farm lived Lyman Cutler, an American settler who had moved to the island to claim land under the U.S. Donation Land Claim Act, a federal initiative encouraging westward expansion. Like many Americans, Cutler believed the island was U.S. territory. He had cleared a few acres, planted potatoes, and built a modest cabin. On June 15, 1859, Cutler found the pig rooting in his potato patch again. This was not the first offense. The pig had trampled rows before, but this time something snapped. In a moment of frustration, Cutler took his rifle and shot the pig dead. By any normal standard, this would have been a minor disagreement between neighbors, irritating, perhaps, but easily settled. But the pig did not live in an ordinary place, and these were not ordinary neighbors. The problem was sovereignty. Ever since the signing of the Oregon Treaty in 1846, which was meant to resolve the border between British North America and the United States, there had been confusion about the ownership of the San Juan Islands. The treaty had stated that the boundary would follow the middle of the channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver Island. Unfortunately, two navigable channels, Haro Strait and Rosario Strait, fit that description. The islands lay between them. The British claimed the eastern Rosario Channel, which placed the islands within their territory. The Americans claimed the Western Haro Channel, which gave the islands to the United States. Neither side had clarified the matter. For over a decade, both British subjects and American settlers had moved to the islands, living in awkward proximity. Now a pig had died, and it belonged to the wrong side. When Griffin confronted Cutler about the shooting, Cutler offered to pay for the pig. He suggested $10 in compensation. Griffin demanded $100, claiming the pig was a prize animal. Cutler refused. Griffin threatened to have him arrested by British authorities. Cutler, in turn, appealed to the American military. Stationed in nearby Port Townsend, the situation escalated quickly. Within weeks, Captain George Pickett, the same Pickett who would later lead the doomed charge at Gettysburg, was dispatched to San Juan Island with a company of 66 American soldiers. He arrived in July and began constructing fortifications. Near the island's southern shore, his orders were vague, but his tone was not. He had come to defend American soil. The British response was equally swift. Captain Geoffrey Hornby, commander of the Royal Navy frigate HMS Tribune, sailed into the bay with several warships. Soon, the British had 3 vessels with over 2,000 men anchored just offshore. Muskets were loaded. Cannons were aimed. Tents went up along the high ridges. Flags were hoisted, the stars and stripes on one hill, the Union Jack on another. And all of this every shovel of trench, every spark from the powder horn because of a pig, to the soldiers and settlers, the tension was very real. Yet to the diplomats back in London and Washington, the conflict was something else. An embarrassment. When the news of the standoff reached Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan already under pressure as sectional divisions pushed the U.S. toward civil war, was mortified. The idea that the United States might enter into an armed conflict with Great Britain over a pig on a remote island was, to say the least, inconvenient. In London, the British Foreign Office expressed similar dismay. The Hudson's Bay Company had long been seen as difficult, but allowing them to drag the empire into war with the U.S. over an unremarkable porker seemed absurd. As tensions built on the island, letters crossed oceans, slowly working their way toward de-escalation. Meanwhile, the soldiers of both nations sat and waited, and willing to attack, but unable to leave. In the months that followed, something strange happened. Despite the official standoff, the American and British troops began to get along. Soldiers from both camps played cards together. They traded tobacco and tea. They shared stories, and occasionally helped each other with construction or repairs. Jokes were made, whiskey was traded, and not a single shot was fired in anger. It became known as the war in which no one died except the pig. Local settlers watched with amusement. For them, the presence of 2 foreign militaries had upsides greater: access to trade goods, protection from raiders, and the rare luxury of choosing which flag to align with on any given day. Still, the matter of the border was unresolved. And as winter approached, supplies grew scarce and patience wore thin. What had started with a pig had become a diplomatic test, a study in how great empires could be drawn into conflict not through intention, but through indifference and ambiguity. And so, the question remained, who truly owned San Juan Island? And what would it take for a pig to force 2 nations to finally decide? You're waking up in a tent pitched on the southern slope of a low hill, canvas walls snapping softly in, the breeze that comes off the Salish Sea. Around you, American soldiers in woolen coats trudge to morning duty, boiling coffee over fire pits, greasing muskets, and scanning the shore for signs of British movement. The Union flag flutters overhead, as it has since July, but no shots ring out. No new graves are dug, because despite the presence of warships, cannon placements, and sharpened bayonets, the conflict remains entirely bloodless. The Pig War, as it would one day be known, had entered a curious phase, a tense but eerily quiet military standstill, where diplomacy moved at the speed of ships, and soldiers passed time with chess, fishing, and fence mending. After the initial flurry of deployments in mid-1859, the situation settled into something more awkward than aggressive. Captain George Pickett, bold and theatrical, had expected to defend the American claim with force if necessary. But his superiors, in Washington Territory and in Washington, D.C., were less enthusiastic. General William S. Harney, commander of the Department of Oregon and a fervent believer in U.S. expansionism, had ordered Pickett to the island, seeing an opportunity to assert American dominance in the Northwest. Harney had made the decision, unilaterally, without consulting the War Department or the President. That would prove problematic. By August, when word of the standoff reached President Buchanan, he was incensed. With the Union already fracturing over slavery and secession looming in the South, the last thing his administration needed was a maritime skirmish with Britain. Orders were sent to General Winfield Scott, the 73-year-old commanding general of the U.S. Army, to quietly clean up the mess. Scott was no stranger to complex diplomacy, a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. He had also been dispatched to settle border disputes in Maine during the Aroostook War, similarly bloodless. Boundary dispute that had resolved with more treaty than trauma. Now, as summer turned to fall, Scott packed his uniform, boarded a steamer, and set sail for the Pacific. Meanwhile, across the water in Victoria, British Columbia, Governor James Douglas was growing equally frustrated. As a former Hudson's Bay Company executive, Douglas had mixed feelings. He wanted to protect British sovereignty and preserve the company's claims, but he also understood how ridiculous the entire affair appeared. He reluctantly allowed Rear Admiral Robert Baines, commander of the Royal Navy's Pacific Station, to anchor ships near San Juan ostensibly to defend British interests. But Baines, like Scott, had no appetite for conflict. Upon seeing the isolated island, its fog-draped forests and humble potato patches, he reportedly scoffed. Two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. Let us not be made fools. By late October, Scott arrived in Washington Territory and quickly moved to de-escalate. He met with Governor Douglas and proposed a simple, peaceful resolution. Both Britain and the U.S. would jointly occupy San Juan Island until the border could be resolved through diplomacy. A token force from each side, no more than 100 soldiers. A peace would maintain their own camps at opposite ends of the island, but refrain from conflict. Douglas agreed reluctantly, and in November 1859, the terms of the joint military occupation were finalized. Captain Pickett, ambitious and somewhat annoyed, was rotated out. In his place came Captain Lewis Cass Hunt, a steadier and less provocative officer. The American camp moved slightly inland to avoid provoking the British. The Royal Marines, meanwhile, pitched their own camp at the northern end of the island, at Garrison Bay, and thus, for the next 12 years, San Juan Island became the home of two peaceful yet fully armed foreign military outposts, both claiming rightful ownership of the same 55-square-mile island, and both largely disinterested in doing anything about it. Life in two camps, the daily rhythms of military life took over. At American camp, soldiers performed drills, tended gardens, chopped firewood, and helped settlers. At British camp, red-coated Marines polished brass buttons, played cricket, and raised pigs and goats. Officers exchanged dinner invitations and joined each other for picnics and band concerts and even joint 4th of July and Queen Victoria Day celebrations. The two camps were a study in contrast. The Americans lived in rough barracks on a windy, exposed bluff, often damp and muddy. The British, meanwhile, enjoyed manicured gardens, refined mess halls, and a library. Their camp even featured an orchestra and a croquet lawn. Tensions did flare on occasion, most often over alcohol, card games, or perceived slights, but these were dealt with through apologies and discipline. In one case, an American private wandered into the British camp and drunkenly challenged a sergeant to a fistfight. He was promptly escorted back, given coffee, and told to sleep it off. Settlers found the arrangement strange but tolerable. Many took advantage of the situation, selling goods to both sides and seeking protection under whichever flag better served their interests that week. The presence of the military also provided some insulation from the growing presence of the Coast Salish peoples, whose ancestral lands had long included San Juan and surrounding islands. while the conflict between empires played out quietly. The original inhabitants of the region found themselves increasingly displaced, though that aspect of the story predictably remained mostly absent from official reports. The long wait. The political negotiations dragged on. Back in London and Washington, the San Juan dispute was periodically raised and just as frequently ignored. The matter was small, distant, and diplomatically thorny. In 1861, the American Civil War erupted, consuming the attention of the U.S. government. British officials, wary of American instability and concerned about their own holdings in Canada, decided to wait. And so, San Juan Island drifted into a kind of bureaucratic purgatory. Soldiers rotated in and out. Commanders were replaced. Gardens were tended. Pigs were raised and, crucially, never again shot. Over time, the island became a sort of living metaphor, a place where imperial ambition had collided with bureaucratic confusion, and where the vast machinery of empire had stalled over a misinterpreted treaty and one ill-fated Berkshire pig. But of course the question still remained. Who owned the island? How, after more than a decade of waiting, would either nation finally decide? You're walking now through a misty field on San Juan Island. It's 1872. The British Union. Jack still flutters at Garrison Bay. The American Stars and Stripes still flaps on the southern bluff. But the foot traffic between the two camps is heavier than ever. Men in blue jackets trading firewood for jam. Red-coated Marines delivering mail. The cannons are still polished, but no one expects them to fire. The soldiers are part guardsmen, part gardeners. And yet the original question, the border still hasn't been answered. The treaty responsible for this stalemate, the Oregon Treaty of 1846, had attempted to draw a clean line across a complex geography, declared the boundary between the United States and British North America should run along the 49th parallel of north latitude to the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island, and thence southerly through the middle of said channel, and of Fuca Straits to the Pacific Ocean. But there was a problem. Between Vancouver Island and the mainland, there wasn't one channel. There were two, the Haro Strait to the west and the Rosario Strait to the east, with the San Juan Islands sitting between them. The treaty didn't specify which one was the channel. The Americans claimed the Haro Strait. The British claimed the Rosario. Each choice placed the San Juans in a different nation's hands. No one thought to clarify this in 1846. Now, in 1872 to 26 years later, they still hadn't. The long and peaceful joint occupation of San Juan had become something of a diplomatic embarrassment. The world's most powerful empire and its most rapidly growing former colony were maintaining two armed camps within shouting distance, over an island smaller than Staten Island. Politicians in London and Washington were growing weary of the matter. It had become clear that neither side was willing to back down. So they agreed to submit the question to arbitration. The arbitrator, a Kaiser with a map, but who could serve as a neutral judge in the affair? Both sides agreed upon an unexpected third party, the German Empire, specifically its new and ambitious monarch, Kaiser Wilhelm I. The Kaiser had recently emerged as the sovereign of a newly unified Germany. Fresh off victory in the Franco-Prussian War, his kingdom was considered neutral. Distant and diplomatically savvy qualities that made him a reasonable candidate for this peculiar boundary. Puzzle. In 1871, formal arbitration proceedings began in Geneva. Legal teams from the United States and Britain presented documents, treaties, old maps, and arguments. Each side argued their channel was the rightful interpretation of the 1846 treaty. American lawyers pointed to early U.S. maps that showed Haro Strait as the principal channel. British representatives countered with cartographic evidence for Rosario Strait. It wasn't just a legal matter. It was about influence in the Pacific, trade routes, and the legitimacy of each empire's ability to define borders. In October 1872, after more than a year of consideration, the Kaiser delivered his verdict. He sided with the United States. The boundary would run through Haro Strait, placing the San Juan Islands firmly within American territory. It was a quiet but decisive end to a long and thankfully peaceful standoff. The British, though disappointed, accepted the decision without protest. The empire had larger concerns, and with Canada now forming a confederated dominion under the crown, losing a few small islands was not a matter worth re-escalating. Departure and legacy. In November 1872, weeks after the decision, British Royal Marines lowered their flag at Garrison Bay and sailed away for the last time. American forces marched north to claim the former British camp. It was the end of the only military occupation in American history that was fully shared with a foreign power in peacetime, and the only war, if one could call it that, ever fought over a pig. The joint camps were abandoned in the following 4 years. The American camp slowly fell into ruin, overtaken by grass and wind. The British camp's gardens returned to wilderness. Settlers remained, but the island's global relevance faded. Still, the impact of the pig war, odd, bureaucratic, and bloodless, left subtle marks on the American consciousness. In some ways, it was a diplomatic rehearsal for a coming century. The dispute had shown that arbitration, patience, and diplomacy could resolve what previous generations would have answered with musket and cannon. It occurred just before the blood-soaked American Civil War, and just after a century of often violent imperial expansion. It was a reminder, quiet but persistent, that not all conflicts needed to end in death. San Juan Island today holds no monuments. 2 fallen soldiers from that standoff, for there were none. There is no battlefield, no casualty list, and no weeping widow in stone. But both American camp and British camp are preserved as part of San Juan Island National Historical Park, where visitors can still walk among the old officers' quarters and cannon placements, reading plaques that explain how 2 empires built forts, trained soldiers, and played music over a pig. The pig reconsidered. As for the pig itself, the unfortunate Berkshire hog, who rooted too greedily in Lyman Cutler's potato patch, its role in history is both minor and monumental. It lived and died in anonymity. Its name was never recorded, likely weighed 150 pounds, and had black and white markings. It belonged to Charles Griffin, an Irishman under contract with the Hudson's Bay Company. It is worth asking why this pig and this event mattered so much. Certainly it did not cause the geopolitical tensions that preceded it. The pig did not draw a treaty or mislabel a map. It didn't write legislation or raise a flag. But its death offered a moment singular, absurd, and memorable that forced both governments to pay attention to what had become a forgotten corner of the world. The pig was, in essence, the final straw in a stack of unresolved imperial questions. Its death provided the narrative clarity needed to galvanize bureaucracies into motion. Without it, the border might have remained ambiguous for decades longer. Sometimes history doesn't pivot on battles or speeches, but on moments so strange, so mundane that they demand examination. A modern reflection: if you visit San Juan Island now, you'll find quiet trails, coastal fog, and signs describing the pig war with a mix of humor and pride. Children laugh at the idea. Tourists buy pig-themed souvenirs. The land itself remains much as it was: bluffs, forests, and a view of 2 nations across the sea. And yet the story lingers for another reason. It asks something of us. It asks how many wars, how many real wars might have been avoided if pride had given way to patience, and if military commanders had waited for the next boat rather than opening fire. It reminds us that borders, often so fiercely defended, are sometimes drawn as much by misunderstanding as by destiny. It reminds us that history, at its core, is full of small things that changed large ones. A pig, a patch of potatoes, a mistaken treaty clause, and a generation of restraint. These were the ingredients for one of the quietest and most enduring lessons in diplomacy ever staged. And in the end, you might still ask, if the pig had stayed in its pen that morning, what would have changed? Would San Juan be Canadian? Would soldiers have died? Would the empires have found a different excuse to draw swords on this lonely, wind-swept island? You are standing on the edge of Venice, the light breaking over water, glinting off 1,000 windows. But your attention is not on the palazzos or canals. Instead, you're looking across the lagoon eastward, to a small island barely a mile. Away, Murano. Quiet now, but in the 13th century it burnt beautifully. This is a story about glass, secrecy, and control. It's about a republic so determined to protect an industry that it turned an island into both a sanctuary and a prison. About artisans who were elevated to aristocrats, yet forbidden to leave under penalty of death. It's not a fable. It's a record of how Venetian glass became both a marvel of medieval technology and a carefully guarded state secret. Let's begin, not with a specific man or battle, but with a material, glass. Because in the 13th century, glass was not a common thing. It was a wonder. Glass in the Middle Ages, a luxury for the few to appreciate the world the Venetian glassmakers. Transformed, you have to understand how rare and difficult glassmaking was in medieval Europe. In a time before eyeglasses, window panes, or telescopes, glass was often reserved for churches and kings. Most people lived their entire lives without seeing a clear glass vessel. Windows, if they existed, were of oiled parchment or mica. Drinking vessels were of pewter, ceramic, or wood. Light came from flame. Vision was dim and blurred. Glass, when it appeared, was thick, foggy, and misshapen. It might be tinted green or brown, pocked with bubbles, fragile and uneven. But even in that crude state, it was mysterious. A material born from sand and fire, which melted into clarity, held light and seemed almost alive. The skill required to make it was immense. One had to gather the right silica-rich sand, blend it with soda ash or potash to lower the melting point, and then raise temperatures in a furnace to well over 1,000 degrees Celsius. This was no small feat in a medieval world where even smelting iron was a major technological hurdle. So when around the 8th or 9th century, some artisans in Venice began refining the techniques of Roman and Byzantine glassmakers, they weren't just craftsmen. They were alchemists, engineers, and performers all at once. By the 13th century, Venice had become Europe's premier port for Eastern luxuries, spices, silk, and yes, glass. And its glassmakers weren't just artisans anymore. They were assets. Why move them to Murano? In 1291, the Venetian government made a bold decision. It ordered that all glass furnaces be moved off the main islands of Venice and relocated to the nearby island of Murano. It's the official reason: fire safety. Venice was, after all, a city of wooden buildings and narrow alleys, and the high heat furnaces of glassmakers posed a real risk. One poorly tended flame could reduce a quarter of the city to ashes. But historians have long suspected another motive: containment. Murano was accessible by water, but easy to watch. By concentrating glassmakers in one place, in island Venice, could more easily control them, monitor their secrets, and protect its monopoly. Glassmaking in Venice had become something greater than an art. It was a cornerstone of the city's wealth and prestige. And Murano would become a city of fire and knowledge, where that wealth was shaped one glowing orb at a time. Life on Murano. Gilded Cage once relocated, the glassmakers of Murano were given an unusual status in Venetian society. They were not treated as mere laborers. It's quite the opposite. They were honored. Many were granted titles of nobility. They could wear swords. Their daughters were allowed to marry into the Venetian patriciates, something unheard of for craftsmen. In most of Europe, the Republic lavished them with rewards, respect, and legal protections. But in exchange, they gave up something crucial: freedom. Glassmakers on Murano were not permitted to leave Venice. If a glassmaker fled the island, he risked losing his property. If he attempted to share the secrets of his trade with foreign powers, he risked assassination. There are records of whispered, rarely confirmed, the Venetian agents traveling to far-off kingdoms to track down runaway artisans and either persuade them to return or silence them permanently. You might think this is an exaggeration, but the Venetian Senate codified these rules. In 1295, it passed laws preventing glassmakers from leaving the Republic. In later years, these laws were reaffirmed, expanded, and enforced with increasing urgency as Venice's control over glass came under threat. And the secret they protected wasn't just any secret. It was Cristallo. The clearest glass in the world if you held a piece of Cristallo in your hand. you would see something that most medieval Europeans had never encountered: transparency. Cristallo was a revolutionary achievement, perfectly clear, nearly colorless and shockingly uniform for its time. It was said to rival and even surpass the finest Roman glass of antiquity. The process to make it was known only to a few families on Murano. It involved meticulous preparation of raw materials, the purest quartz sand, carefully refined soda ash, and a substance called manganese dioxide to neutralize the natural green or brown tints in the sand. The mix had to be heated slowly, stirred constantly, and shaped by hand using long metal pipes and wooden molds. Every stage required expertise. Even the tiniest speck of ash or an incorrect breath at the blowpipe could ruin a piece. Glassmakers developed special recipes, guarded within families for generations, and passed only to Sunzor trusted apprentices sworn to secrecy. With Cristallo, Murano became the only place in Europe that could produce truly fine glass. It wasn't just beautiful, it was functional. It enabled better mirrors, more accurate lenses, and finer vessels. It was exported across Europe and the Mediterranean, a luxury good rivaling gold in price. And Venice guarded it with everything it had. The politics of flamed back in Venice. The ruling elite watched Murano with admiration and anxiety. The wealth of the Republic depended on maritime trade, yes, but also on its ability to outclass its neighbors. Venetian glass was sold in Constantinople, Cairo, London, and Paris. It was found in the treasuries of popes and princes. Even the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire reportedly imported Murano glass by the crate. But what if the secret leaked? What if another kingdom, Florence, Naples, or worse, a rival in northern Europe, learned to make Cristallo? The Venetian Senate responded with more laws. Families with glassmaking knowledge were registered, records were kept, marriages were tracked. Sons of glassmakers were expected to remain in the trade. Daughters, though they did not make glass, were expected to marry within the island, preserving the web of families that kept the secrets alive. This was not just a guild, it was a society within a society, complete with its own rules, customs, and quiet tensions. And sometimes someone tried to leave. A whisper of rebellion. There are tales, half-legend, of glassmakers who tried to escape Murano. One story tells of Antonio Neri, a priest and alchemist who trained in Murano before traveling to Florence in the early 1600s, though not a glassblower himself. Neri compiled much of what he'd learnt into a book, L'Art Vitreria, The Art of Glass. It was eventually published and translated, becoming one of the earliest public manuals on glassmaking. By then, Venice's monopoly was already slipping. Other cities, Bohemia, Altair, even England, had begun experimenting with glassmaking, often hiring runaway artisans or attempting to reverse engineer Murano glass. The genie, so to speak, was leaving the bottle. But in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, the boundaries were still firm. Murano was still the heart of light. Its fires burnt day and night, casting reflections on the lagoon. The men who stoked those fires, who shaped molten light into vessels and chandeliers and beads, they lived gilded lives on a small island they were never meant to leave. As the 15th century approached, whispers began to grow louder. Other cities wanted what Venice had. Kings offered gold for secrets. Some glassmakers, lured by fortune, began to wonder, what if we could leave? What if we sold our knowledge elsewhere? And Venice, in turn, began to clamp down even harder. Which raises a question we'll answer in the next section. What happens when you turn craftsmen into prisoners, and their art into a weapon of state? It's evening now on Murano. Picture the island wrapped in an orange glow light from furnaces. Dancing on the surface of the canals, the clang of tools has slowed, and most of the artisans have stepped away from their benches, their faces marked by soot and reflection. But even now, long after the work of the day, the fires are never fully out. The island lives by the rhythm of flame. The year is 1450, give or take. Venice is still rising, still rich, still proud. And Murano is no longer just a craft center, it is a legal construct. Controlled ecosystem designed by the Venetian Senate to safeguard one of its most precious exports. And make no mistake, Venice's glass industry was an export in every sense of the word. Murano's chandeliers adorned the ballrooms of Polish nobles. Its mirrors caught the eyes of Parisian duchesses. Its goblets were prized at Ottoman feasts. But behind the beauty was a dense web of laws, punishments, family politics, and quiet surveillance. Let's step back onto the island and see what life was like, not for a legend or a rebel but for a typical glassmaker, perhaps someone like Matteo Zeno. Matteo Zeno, a name among many. Matteo Zeno never appears in history books. His name is chosen here from a real Murano registry, one of hundreds of glassmakers recorded in the late 15th century. He would have risen with the sun or earlier. Before the bells of Murano's churches rang, the apprentices would already be preparing the day's fuel, stoking furnaces to reach searing heat. Glass blowing was not a leisurely art. It required endurance, precision, and pain tolerance. Tools were few but precise. An iron blowpipe for shaping glass, pontile rod for handling molten pieces, wooden paddles for shaping, and tongs and scissors for cutting. Each tool was handed down, repaired, and remade. Glassmakers rarely bought new ones unless absolutely necessary. Like the craft itself, the tools were an inheritance. What separated Matteo and Murano's workers as a whole from craftsmen elsewhere in Europe was not merely skill. It was their legal status. Matteo, despite being a tradesman, likely had more legal protection than a merchant. If he was a master, he may have belonged to a glassmakers' collegio or association, which granted him the ability to vote on guild matters, regulate apprenticeships, and interact with Murano's island council. His children would attend local schools, where lessons weren't just Latin and numbers, but also family history, commercial etiquette, and the unwritten rules of life under surveillance, because everyone knew the secrets must stay on the island. Surveillance in the Serenissima Venice in the 15th century was no ordinary republic. It was in many ways an early surveillance state. Run by an oligarchy of noble families, Venice relied on a dense bureaucratic network to maintain power laws. Were meticulously recorded, citizens cataloged, and industries like glass heavily monitored. The Council of Ten, a secretive committee of patricians, had wide-ranging authority over matters of espionage, internal security, and industrial protection. It could order arrests, exile, or even extrajudicial executions if they deemed a citizen's actions a threat to the state. In Murano, this meant that even everyday decisions, glassmaker hiring a foreign apprentice, a family seeking to travel abroad, could trigger scrutiny. The most feared situation? If Matteo, for instance, had decided to secretly leave Venice and head for Florence, or Paris, or Prague, perhaps tempted by an offer from a foreign duke, his entire family would face penalties. His property might be confiscated, could be shuttered. And if caught, he might be brought back under armed escort, or not brought back at all. There are rumors in Venetian archives, dark notations, and Senate minutes about glassmakers lost overseas. One entry in 1492, redacted but legible, references measures taken in Smyrna regarding a runaway artisan. Another mentions the quiet return of a son whose father had defected years prior. Whether these were kidnappings or assassinations, no one said out loud. But everyone knew not to ask. Rewards for loyalty, this constant threat might suggest a miserable life for Murano's artisans. But in truth, for many it was the opposite. Those who played by the rules were richly rewarded. Glassmakers were allowed to form dynasties, and their names became part of the island's social fabric. Families like the Baroviers, the Miatas, the Segusos, many of which survive today, built small empires of craftsmanship, each specializing in different techniques: filigree, millefiori, latimo milk glass, and enamel work. Some families even formed marriage alliances, much like noble houses elsewhere. A Barovier daughter might marry a Miotti son, ensuring that secret sand clients stayed within Murano's tight circles. In many ways, this was a parallel aristocracy, not of land or lineage, but of mastery, and Venice loved to showcase them. Foreign ambassadors visiting the Republic were often brought to Murano as a kind of industrial theater. They watched demonstrations, walked past gleaming showrooms, and sipped wine from delicate goblets. but they were never allowed to see everything. The real techniques, the recipes, the furnace calibrations, the proprietary molds were kept behind locked doors, and even apprentices had to earn their way into knowledge. A young boy might spend 7 years cleaning tools, carrying wood, and observing silently before he was allowed to handle molten glass. By the time he did, he was usually bound to the workshop for life. Secrecy wasn't a matter of paranoia. It was the island's lifeblood. Spreading embers. The leak of secrets by the early 1500s, however, something changed. Despite all the laws and all the controls, glassmaking knowledge began to leak. Some artisans, disillusioned or desperate, fled the island. Others were kidnapped. By foreign agents, yes, this actually happened. Cities like Amsterdam, Antwerp, and London were desperate to develop their own industries. One of the most famous examples came from the city of Altir, in what is now Liguria. There, a separate school of glassmakers emerged, some of whom claimed ancestry from Murano. They began producing Venetian-style glass using similar techniques, and Venice took notice. Laws were revised. Threats were renewed. The moment techniques became reproducible in print is, with Tonio Neri's glass-making manual, the Republic's monopoly began to erode. It didn't happen all at once. Murano glass remained the gold standard well into the 17th century. The flame of exclusivity began to flicker. Murano's legacy still, for all its lost secrets, Murano endured. Even today, the island remains a haven for glassmakers. Visitors wander its narrow streets, peering into open studios, watching artisans create with tools and techniques nearly unchanged in 700 years. Modern glassmakers no longer fear death for leaving the island. They teach, travel, and innovate. But something of the old mystery remains. There is still a kind of reverence in the way glass is made here, still a pride in the long, careful dance of heat and breath, rotation and risk. And if you ask the descendants of those old families, they'll smile politely, but they won't tell you everything. Some secrets, after all, still belong to the fire. As the 16th century drew to a close, the furnaces of Murano still glowed in the night, lighting up the canals like veins of molten gold. Ships still came and went from the Fondamenta de Vettre, bearing crates of delicately packed goblets, beads, and the crown jewel of Venetian glassmaking, the mirror. But change was coming, not all at once, and not with a bang, but with quiet. Erosion. What began as whispered promises in courtly halls would eventually spell the end of Venice's greatest industrial secret. Let us now follow the path of that most mysterious object, the Venetian mirror, and the men, and markets that shattered the illusion of Murano's eternal monopoly. The mirror, perfected Venetian mirrors, were not the first mirrors in Europe, nor even the first glass ones, but they were, for a long time, unquestionably the best. Prior to the 1500s, most mirrors were made of polished metal, usually bronze or silver. These gave a distorted, shadowy reflection, more suggestion than image. The idea of seeing oneself clearly, in full detail, was novel, almost unsettling. Then came Cristallo. Invented by Angelo Baroviere in the 15th century, Cristallo was a nearly colorless, flawless glass, combined with the technique of backing the glass with mercury and tin amalgama, a process that required perfect timing and immense care. Murano's artisans produced mirrors that reflected with shocking clarity. These mirrors were status symbols. They adorned the palaces of kings and popes. Catherine de' Medici had Venetian mirrors installed in her apartments. Louis XIV of France was so enamored with them that he would eventually build an entire hall to reflect his power, the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. But that hall, ironically, would be the scene of Murano's greatest defeat. Because while Venice tried to keep its artisans confined, France was plotting their escape. The Great Mirror Heist, the 17th century, brought with it a new breed of mercantilist ambition. Nations no longer wanted to import luxury goods. They wanted to make them, control them, and profit from them. And no one understood this better than Jean-Baptiste Colbert, finance minister of Louis XIV. Colbert sought to turn France into a self-sufficient industrial giant. He created monopolies, tariffs, and state-backed companies. and in 1665 he established the manufacture Royale des Glaces de Miroirs, the Royal Mirror Factory. But there was a problem. France had no glassmakers skilled enough to rival Murano. The Venetian mirrors were still leagues ahead in quality and technique. So Colbert did what any determined minister might. He hired spies. He sent agents to Venice posing as merchants, scholars, and even suitors. Their goal? To convince Murano's artisans to defect, and incredibly, they succeeded. Between 1665 and 1670, several master glassmakers from Murano secretly left the island and crossed into France. They brought with them the techniques, formulas, and tools of the trade, often in their heads, and sometimes in hidden crates. Venice was furious. The Senate declared them traitors. Property was seized. Families back on Murano were fined or punished. The Council of Ten even attempted to assassinate the defectors. One of them was reportedly poisoned in Paris, though the records are murky, but the damage was done. Within a few years, the French Royal Mirror Factory was producing glass. Of comparable quality, Venice's centuries-old monopoly had been shattered not by war, but by wages. The business of secrets Murano did not collapse overnight. Its artisans continued to produce remarkable work. The island still held prestige, especially among collectors and traditionalists. But by the 18th century, the tide had turned. Mirrors were being made in London, Amsterdam, Bohemia, and beyond. Each region adapted and innovated, applying local resources and chemistry to improve on Venetian methods. Venetian glassmakers tried to adapt. They shifted focus from exclusivity to ornamentation, crafting more elaborate chandeliers, lace-like glasswork, and decorative figures. Some embraced color. Others made novelty items for the growing middle class. But the days of state-sanctioned secrecy of glassmakers as protected citizens slowly ended. The Republic of Venice itself was weakening politically and economically. By the time Napoleon invaded in 1797 and formally dissolved the Republic, Murano had already lost much of its international dominance. Still, the legacy endured. Even under Austrian rule, and later as part of unified Italy, Murano's glassmakers retained their identity. They had lost the monopoly, yes, but not the art. What was left behind? What remains most striking about this? The story is not the fall itself, but the structure Venice had created to protect an idea. It wasn't just glass. It was the first true case of intellectual property being enforced by law. Today, companies use patents and trademarks. In 15th century Venice, they used exile, social shaming, and assassins. Murano's model was brutal, but it was effective for a time. The island was a factory, a prison, a guild, and a dream, all at once. It was proof that even the most delicate things like light through a crystal goblet could shape the economy of an empire. The story of Murano is also a reminder of how fragile monopolies are. No secret lasts forever. Knowledge, like molten glass, wants to flow, and eventually it will find cracks in the mold. Today on Murano, if you were to visit Murano now, you would find a quieter place. The island is part craft village, part museum. Workshops still hum with heat. Tourists watch demonstrations and buy souvenirs. The same family, names Barovere, Seguso, and Toso, still appear above studio doors. But the intensity of secrecy is gone. In its place, there is pride, there is innovation, and there is the quiet acknowledgement that the old ways, however rigid, built something that endured. Modern Murano glass is still valued not just for beauty, but for tradition. Each piece carries centuries of trial, error, protection, and betrayal. Every glass, every mirror, is a reflection not just of the maker, but of the island's strange and glowing past. And as you set it down and watch the light scatter through it, you might wonder what other secrets once burnt in silence, for the world caught their shine.